My mother texted me that I was not invited to the luxury Mediterranean cruise I had fully funded for our family right after I bought them a house worth nearly $1 million. So I sold the house while they were sailing across the ocean. You will not believe what happened when they returned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Lydia and I am 34 years old. I stood at the Delta check-in counter at the international terminal feeling a rare sense of genuine excitement. My luxury boutique staging firm had just concluded its most profitable quarter yet, and I was ready to celebrate. The terminal around me buzzed with the frantic energy of travelers dragging oversized luggage and checking departure boards. I held my passport tightly in my hand. I had spent $30,000 booking a 2-week Mediterranean cruise for my family. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, a chance for all of us to reconnect after a highly stressful year. I had booked premium staterooms for my parents, Patricia and Richard, and a suite for my older brother Cameron and his wife Courtney. I even arranged for private excursions in Greece and Italy, hoping to create memories we could cherish for a lifetime. I was next in line to check my bags when my phone chimed with a text message notification. I pulled it from my pocket, expecting a message from my mother asking where we should meet near the gate. Instead, the text from Patricia read, "You are not coming. Dad wants just family. We gave your ticket to Courtney's sister." I stared at the glowing screen, trying to process the words. My brain simply refused to compute the sheer cruelty of the message. Just family. I was her daughter. I was the one who had carefully planned the entire itinerary over the past 6 months. I was the one who had paid for every single aspect of this luxury vacation. How could I suddenly not be family? The absolute audacity of giving my premium ticket to my sister-in-law's sister was staggering. A woman I had met exactly twice was currently preparing to board a ship on my dime while I stood abandoned at the airport. I stepped out of the check-in line, ignoring the annoyed sighs of the passengers behind me, and immediately dialed my mother's number. It rang 3 times before someone answered, but it was not my mother. It was my 37-year-old brother Cameron. He laughed loudly into the receiver over the background noise of the busy airport lounge. "Well, if it is not the workaholic spinster," Cameron said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "What do you want, Lydia? We are about to board the plane." I demanded to know what was going on and why my mother had sent that horrific text message. Cameron sighed loudly into the phone as if I was being an unbearable nuisance. "Look, Lydia, you need to stop acting so entitled right now. Courtney's sister really needed a vacation. She has been going through a hard time, and frankly, she is much more fun to be around than you. You always bring the mood down with your constant business talk and serious attitude." Cameron. "I paid $30,000 for this trip," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "You cannot just give away a ticket that I purchased with my own hard-earned money to a stranger." Cameron scoffed loudly. "Your hard-earned money? Please, you just decorate houses for rich people. It is not like you have a real job that contributes anything meaningful to society. I am launching a massive cryptocurrency firm next month, and I need this trip to decompress before the big launch. You know how stressful the startup world is. You should be supporting my mental health instead of throwing a massive tantrum at the check-in counter." I could barely comprehend his deep delusion. Cameron was a perpetual failure who constantly called himself an entrepreneur but had never actually built a successful company in his entire life. Every single venture he touched went bankrupt within a year. And now he was lecturing me about hard work while standing in a VIP lounge that I had paid for. Before I could respond to his absurd claims, I heard scuffling on the other end of the line. My mother Patricia snatched the phone from him. Her tone was sharp and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Lydia, you need to calm down and stop making a scene," Patricia snapped. "You have plenty of money. You can go to Europe anytime you want. Your brother desperately needs this relaxation. He has been under so much extreme pressure lately trying to build his legacy." "Mom, you told me I was not family," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You took my ticket and gave it to a complete stranger." "Do not twist my words," Patricia replied smoothly, instantly deploying her favorite gaslighting tactic. Your father and I just wanted a peaceful family vacation without you constantly reminding us how much everything costs. You are always so terribly selfish, always trying to ruin your brother's happiness. Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I paid for the cruise. I just bought you and Dad a $966,000 house in a beautiful coastal Florida community because you were secretly drowning in massive debt and facing immediate bankruptcy. I completely saved you from losing everything. Patricia scoffed, completely unbothered by the stark reality of my massive financial support. We let you buy us that house, Lydia. It was the very least you could do after everything we sacrificed to raise you. You owe us this piece. We are keeping the ticket. Do not call us again until we get back from our trip. The line went completely dead. I lowered the phone slowly. I stood in the middle of the bustling terminal holding my luggage handle. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg them to let me come. The lifetime of constantly trying to buy their love, of hoping that my financial support would finally earn me a secure place in their hearts, vanished in a single instant. A cold and absolute clarity washed over me. I realized then that they would never ever see me as a daughter. I was just a convenient ATM to them, a bottomless source of funding for their beloved golden child, Cameron. As I watched the families around me hugging and laughing, the stark contrast between their joy and my isolation became agonizingly clear. I had spent weeks picking out the perfect shore excursions, researching the best local restaurants in Florence, and carefully coordinating our travel schedules. I had even purchased matching luggage tags, a silly gesture that now felt deeply humiliating. All that effort, all that meticulous planning meant absolutely nothing to them. They had effortlessly discarded me the moment they secured the financial benefits of the trip. The realization settled heavy in my chest, replacing the initial shock with a burning, righteous indignation. I was not just a neglected daughter. I was a fully functioning adult who had allowed herself to be financially exploited under the guise of family loyalty. That realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also the exact medicine I needed to finally wake up. I turned my luggage cart around and walked away from the Delta counter. I found a quiet table at a terminal cafe overlooking the busy tarmac. I ordered a black coffee, sat down, and opened my laptop. No worries. I texted back to the family group chat. Have a great trip. Then I securely logged into the cruise line portal. My corporate credit card was linked to every single stateroom on their reservation. They were expecting to enjoy 2 entire weeks of unlimited luxury on my dime. With a few simple clicks, I completely revoked the payment authorization for Patricia, Richard, Cameron, and Courtney. I canceled the premium unlimited drink packages. I canceled the private guided tours in Rome. I canceled the beautiful sunset catamaran excursion in Santorini. I canceled the expensive luxury spa credits Courtney had booked for herself and her sister. I removed my credit card from their onboard accounts entirely. Once they boarded that massive ship, they would have absolutely $0 attached to their room keys. They would have to individually pay for every bottle of water, every meal outside the main dining hall, and every single excursion out of their own empty pockets. A deeply satisfying smile spread across my face as I closed the cruise portal. Let us see how they enjoy Europe with $0, I thought to myself. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, feeling significantly lighter than I had in many years. The toxic cord tying me to their endless entitlement had finally been severed. But my moment of peaceful clarity was abruptly interrupted. My phone vibrated heavily on the cafe table. It was an urgent push notification from my premium property management application. I opened the app and stared at the alert in utter confusion. The smart locks on the $966,000 coastal Florida house I had just purchased for my parents had been manually overridden. Someone had explicitly entered the master security code and permanently changed the locks. My blood ran completely cold. My parents were supposed to be boarding a flight to Europe right now. They could not possibly be at the coastal property. I tapped the screen to immediately view the security camera feed from the driveway. The live video loaded and my jaw clenched tight. A massive commercial moving truck was backed perfectly into the driveway of the pristine coastal estate. I could see two strange men carrying a large leather sofa through the front doors. The audacity of this new betrayal ignited a blazing fire inside me. I slammed my laptop shut and grabbed my bags. I was no longer going to play the role of the victim. It was time for absolute justice. The drive from the airport took less than 40 minutes, but my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The bright Florida sun beat down heavily on the windshield as I pulled through the security gates of the exclusive 55-plus coastal community. The neighborhood was exceptionally quiet this time of day, mostly filled with retirees driving golf carts and tending to their pristine flower beds. I turned onto the palm-lined cul-de-sac, fully expecting to find an empty driveway. Instead, a massive commercial moving truck blocked the entire entrance. Its heavy diesel engine idled loudly, disrupting the peaceful silence of the street. A crew of sweaty men in matching gray uniforms hauled heavy cardboard boxes and unwieldy furniture up the expensive paver walkway. I slammed my car into park right behind the massive truck and marched straight toward the custom glass front doors. The smart lock panel on the front door was entirely dark. The protective cover had been forcibly popped off, and the internal wiring manually reset. The property damage made my pulse pound. I had personally paid a premium to have that high-end security system installed just to ensure my parents felt safe and comfortable in their new retirement home. To see it destroyed so casually was a physical blow that momentarily stunned me. I took a deep breath, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped inside. I walked through the open double doors and immediately stopped in my tracks. Courtney stood squarely in the middle of the grand foyer, holding a clipboard in one hand and a venti iced coffee in the other. My older brother Cameron had married her 5 years ago, and she possessed the exact same brand of unearned arrogance and deep delusion that he did. She pointed a manicured finger toward the master suite, barking orders at the crew like a dictator. "Be careful with that leather sectional," she yelled at two exhausted movers struggling under the weight of a massive, ugly brown couch. "It goes right against the far wall by the bay windows. Do not scuff the hardwood floors." "Courtney," I said, my voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings of the foyer. "What exactly is going on here?" Courtney spun around. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her face twisted into a smug, self-satisfied grin. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced coffee, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Well, if it is not the angry sister," she said, clicking her pen against the clipboard. "I thought you were supposed to be crying in an airport terminal right now. Cameron said you threw a massive fit at the check-in counter when you found out my sister got your ticket." "I asked you a direct question, Courtney," I said, taking a slow, calculated step closer to her. "Why is there a commercial moving truck parked in the driveway of my property, and why are movers currently carrying Cameron's atrocious furniture into the master bedroom?" Courtney laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed loudly off the walls. "Your property? That is hilarious, Lydia. Really funny." She casually flipped to the second page on her clipboard and ripped off a crumpled piece of paper. She held it out to me like she was handing a parking ticket to a stranger. "Patricia did not text you before their flight took off. She and Richard signed the deed over to Cameron yesterday morning before they left for Europe. It is our house now. Mom said you can come by next week to pick up your staging furniture. We do not need your cold minimalist aesthetic in our new family home. We are bringing in our own interior decorator tomorrow." I took the crumpled paper from her hand. It was a standard fill in the blank legal template clearly printed from a free online website. At the very top, someone had hastily scribbled "quitclaim deed" in bright blue ink. Below that, my mother and father had signed their names, supposedly transferring full ownership of the luxury property to my brother Cameron. There was no official notary stamp anywhere on the page. There was no raised county seal. There was nothing connecting this garbage paper to any legitimate real estate transaction. My parents had actually believed they could simply gift a nearly $1 million house to my brother just because they felt completely entitled to the wealth I had built from the ground up. They assumed that because I handed them the keys to save them from their mounting credit card debt, They owned the very ground the property stood on. They viewed my money as family money, and my assets as theirs to distribute to the golden child. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they did not end up homeless, and this was how they repaid my generosity. I stared at the fake deed, fighting the sudden urge to burst out laughing at the sheer stupidity of their plan. "Courtney," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm, "Patricia and Richard do not own this house." Courtney rolled her eyes heavily, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, stop being so bitter, Lydia. Mom and Dad bought this place for their retirement. They just decided that Cameron needed it more than they did, since he is actually trying to build a lasting legacy for this family. You have plenty of money. You do not need to be so greedy and selfish all the time." I took a deep breath, letting the absolute absurdity of her statement wash over me. "I bought this house, Courtney," I explained slowly and clearly, as if speaking to a small child. "I paid $966,000 in pure cash for this property exactly 89 days ago. I did not put it in Patricia or Richard's name. I purchased this coastal estate under a blind limited liability company strictly for tax purposes. My name is the only name on the corporate operating agreement. The property taxes, the utility bills, and the homeowners association fees are all paid directly from my business accounts." Courtney's smug smile faltered just a fraction. "You are lying. Mom showed us the paperwork. They signed the contract right in front of us. They signed a standard residential lease agreement." I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave. "I allowed them to live here rent-free because the bank was about to foreclose on their condo in Connecticut. They are tenants, Courtney, nothing more. You cannot sign over a deed to a property you merely rent. This piece of paper you just handed me is legally worthless." Courtney's face flushed a deep, angry red. She stepped forward, aggressively invading my personal space. "You are just jealous," she spat venomously. "You have always been
Oli,
terribly
no
jealous
me
that
creo
Cameron
que
is
ya
the
hayan
favorite
pasado 3
child. You
pomodoros
cannot stand that he is finally going to be
tres
more
temas.
successful than you.
Me parece
You think
muy
you can just
fuerte.
control
Estoy haciendo
everyone with
tripotes
your
del
money,
último
but
tema.
Cameron is 10
Voy
steps
a
ahead
poner
of
el call,
you."
¿vale?
I looked at her, genuinely
Y
curious
necesito
about the
hacer
depths
más
of their shared
esta
delusion.
mañana.
10 steps ahead.
Que luego
By
tenemos 5
attempting to
como avance,
steal a
pero
house he does
igualmente
not
me
own.
gustaría ir
Courtney
bien.
sneered, leaning in close. By
Lluvia,
securing our
chimenea,
financial future,
vidrio,
no
ruido,
thanks to you.
color y animales.
Cameron is already taking out a
Y estoy un poco
$500,000 home equity line
no
of
saturada,
credit
sino
against
un
this property
poco
while he is
asustada,
on
pero
the
bueno,
cruise.
de momento me
He
lo estoy
signed the
sabiendo. Hay
electronic
cosas que
bank
aún no, pero
documents this
obviamente es
morning
normal. Pero bueno,
using the deed
no
transfer
falla,
Mom
empieza el
gave us.
descanso y
He is
me
finally
pilla
launching
aquí.
his new
Pero
cryptocurrency
bueno, ¿cómo estáis
firm.
vosotros?
We
¿Qué
are going to
tal?
be
¿Cómo os está
wealthy,
yendo
and you are
la
going to be stuck
mañana
staging
y
houses for
todo?
other people.
Decidme
The air
cosas
in the
bonitas,
grand
cosas
foyer suddenly
buenas,
felt
porque
completely
madre mía.
still. My eyes locked onto Courtney's face. I
Tío,
processed
mañana
her
me llega
arrogant
la
words with a
tinta
cold, terrifying clarity.
y quiero
My
imprimir.
brother was notoriously
Porque
bad
al
with
final
money,
he comprado
but I
tinta.
never
Me ha
expected
hecho
him to
muchísimo.
cross the
No
line
hay
into
seca,
outright
tío, esto.
criminality. Cameron
Es
applied for a
que
$500,000 loan against
yo
this
es que no
property.
sé,
I asked, my tone
no sé
dangerously
cómo funcionan estos
quietly.
pomos. A veces
"Yes,"
largos, a
Courtney
veces
bragged,
cortos.
lifting her chin
Depende, ¿sabes?
triumphantly. "The funds
¿Qué
clear
te
on
pasa,
Monday
tío?
morning, so you can take
No
your
sé,
fake
hijos.
LLC story
Adoro,
and
tío.
shove it,
A
Lydia.
ver,
The
cansadas
bank accepted
estamos.
the deed
Cansadas,
transfer.
queremos
We own
dormir,
this
de
house
todo,
now.
tío.
I want you off my property
Os
before I call
entiendo.
the police for trespassing." She turned her
Yo
back
estoy
on me
pensando,
and walked toward the master suite, yelling at the movers to be careful with a cheap
yo
floor
estoy
lamp.
pensando en que todo
She had
esto me voy
absolutely
a saltar
no
esta
idea
opción.
what she had
Sí,
just
dale, Alba,
confessed to
tú sigue, tú
doing.
tranquila. Que
Cameron
tienes
had
el
not just
examen y
acted
tal, tú
entitled.
tranquila.
He had taken a forged document signed by
Estoy
simple
pensando en que me
residential
tengo que meter
tenants
todo
and
esto. O sea,
deliberately
son 12
submitted it
temas
to a
porque hay
federal
uno que
banking
no
institution
entra.
to extract
12
$500,000 in
y uno
equity from
es
a corporate asset he
embryo
did not
que
own.
me hice un
He was
esquema
using
fake, así que
electronic banking
será bien.
systems to process the transaction.
Gracias.
My brother
Voy a
was
empezar a
not
por
just
agua
a
que me acabé
failing
la botella.
entrepreneur
Tío, tengo que ir a
anymore.
por agua, tío.
He was
Hola
actively
Lidia, ¿qué
committing
tal? ¿Cómo
federal wire
estás?
fraud and bank
¿Cuánto
fraud
tiempo, tío?
against my corporation, while
Ay,
floating
la
somewhere
vida.
in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea,
Estoy pensando
drinking
en que me tengo que
cocktails on
meter
my
los
canceled
12
credit
temas
card.
más esto. Yo creo que
He
sí
was
que me da
facing
tiempo.
decades in federal
Bueno,
prison
12.
because
Ahora
he
me he
felt
mirado 3.
entitled to steal my
Es decir, que me
hard-earned
quedan 9.
success. I did not scream at
9, 8
Courtney.
vamos a
I did
tirarle.
not demand that she throw the movers out right then and there.
A ver si
I
ahora en
simply
estos
pulled my
2.
cell
Es que
phone
estoy
from my
haciendo
pocket
cálculos, lo
and walked
prometo,
straight
necesito
out
hacer
the front door
cálculos.
into the warm
En
afternoon
estos
air.
2,
The
a
warm
ver si
Florida
puedo
heat
hacer
wrapped
el
around my
4 y el
shoulders, but
5,
my mind was completely ice
quedarme con
cold.
7.
I had tried to
Y esta
protect my
tarde
family
hacer
for
también.
years, but they had chosen their
Quedarme
path.
con 7,
I
no,
stood on
hacer
the
3 esta
manicured
mañana
front
y quedarme
lawn
con
listening to the
6,
loud
porque
crash of
embrión es
furniture being
poco,
moved
tío.
inside my home.
Oli, si me tomo una semana
The
después de mi
sound no
último
longer
examen, pero
bothered
volví.
me.
Normal, tía,
It
que
was
si no
simply the
es una
noise of a
petada
trap
de
snapping
cerebro
shut on
brutal. O
their
sea,
greed. I
yo tengo unas
dialed the
ganas de
direct number
terminar
for
solo para
Silas,
poder
my
estar
corporate
tranquila.
real estate attorney.
Estoy planteando
He
esa
answered on the
existencia.
second ring.
Es
Silas,
que
I said,
el
staring at the
examen no es
massive
difícil
moving
en sí.
truck idling in
Además
my
es muy
driveway.
interesante
Call the
y la
commercial
verdad es
real
que
estate
me está
broker
entrando bastante
immediately.
bien dentro de la
It is
cabeza.
now time to sell
Lo
the
que me da un
coastal
poco de
property
miedo. O
today.
sea, no os voy a
Put the
mentir, porque
listing up
además
within
es
the
el
hour
último,
and
entonces me da
tell
un
them
poco
we
de
are only
cosa
accepting pure cash offers
que
for
me
an
da un poco de
immediate
miedo, ¿sabéis?
close.
O sea, es lo
They
típico de es
wanted
el
to play
último,
games
pero
with
me da
my
miedo porque
property, but
imagínate
they
que
are
tengo que
about to
estudiármelo
learn
para
that the house
jueves
always
que
wins.
viene. No,
I
no, no.
walked right
Queremos
back through the heavy
hacerlo
custom
ahora.
glass doors of
Entonces
the
por eso me da un
house,
poco de
letting
miedo.
them swing shut behind me with a solid
Y
thud.
también porque no he visto
The
muchos
two
exámenes, o
movers
sea,
were
solo he
halfway
visto
across the
uno
expansive
y está
grand
bastante bien,
foyer,
pero es del
sweating
2022. Y
profusely
me han
under the
pasado,
immense
mi
weight
amiga
of
me ha pasado
Cameron's
el
ugly
del año
brown leather
pasado,
sectional.
que también lo quiero
The
mirar.
couch was an absolute
Por eso,
monstrosity, complete with built-in
pensando
plastic
demasiado,
cup
yo
holders
sobrepienso y
and cheap
pienso
reclining
y así es
mechanisms
la vida,
that
tío.
clanked loudly
Pero
with
bueno,
every step they
nada,
took.
contadme cosas,
It
tío.
looked
Que
utterly
yo me despido, que me voy,
ridiculous
muchas
against
gracias
the
por todo, soy el
pristine white
fulanito y
marble
acabo de vuestro
flooring
último examen.
and the
Nada, muy
elegant coastal
gracias.
aesthetic I had
Muchísimo ánimo en el
meticulously
examen oral
designed.
que
I
vas a
raised my
hacerlo
voice so
súper
it
bien, o
carried
sea, lo
clearly and
sé.
sharply over the
Y,
echoing
jope, no
space.
quiero llorar,
Put the
tío.
furniture
Muchas
down right
gracias
now.
por haber
I
estado aquí
instructed the
mucho
men,
tiempo. A ver
my
si
tone
en
leaving
septiembre nos
absolutely
vemos o en
zero
septiembre,
room for
octubre más o menos.
negotiation.
Y
If you
disfruta
take
también del
one more
verano
step into this house, you will
y
be
todo, tío.
actively participating in a felony
Que
home
no soy muy
invasion.
buena con las
I am
despedidas,
the
tío.
sole
Es
legal
que me voy a
owner of
poner a
this
llorar.
property, and I am officially
Y nada, a ver
ordering
si
you to
hacemos
stop.
el
The two
directo
men
Fata y
froze
yo y
instantly.
el PAMI
They
es
looked
de
from
este
me
de
to
jugar y
Courtney,
cosas así.
completely unsure of who held actual
La
authority in this
semana,
bizarre
dentro de 2 semanas.
situation. The taller mover, a burly
Ay,
guy
pero
with a
bueno,
worn baseball
intentemos no
cap,
llorar.
carefully lowered his end of the
Si
heavy
nada, estamos
couch
otra
to
vez
the
ahí estudiando.
floor.
No digas eso.
He wiped his dripping
Que
brow
el
with the
verano
back of
sea
his
largo, en
hand
plan. A mí
and
me gusta
muttered that
mucho
his
estar aquí
crew did
estudiando
not
con
want any
vosotros, pero
legal
también me
trouble.
gusta el descanso
He
y me
signaled
gusta
to his
dormir, tío.
partner, and they both
Me da un
stepped
poco
away
de
from the
respeto el
sectional
año que viene
retreating
porque voy a
toward the
coger
open
muchas
front doors.
asignaturas. O sea,
Courtney let out a
obviamente,
shrill,
si me
piercing
dejan
shriek of pure
pasar
indignation.
y coger las
She marched up to
pequeñitas,
the
¿vale?
tall mover
Ay,
and
joder.
demanded he pick the sofa back up immediately.
Si me dejan
She
pasar
screamed that she
y
was
todas
paying
estas
them by the
cosas,
hour
me da un poco
and
de
that they needed
respeto,
to follow
tío.
her
De
strict
darle mucho ánimo
orders.
al resto.
When the man
Nada, mucho
refused,
ánimo
shaking his
y
head and
muchos
backing
besos y
further
todo,
down the
tío.
driveway, Courtney
Y pues
completely
eso, me
lost
da
whatever
respeto
little
porque son muchas
composure she had
asignaturas.
left.
Obviamente voy a
Her
dejar las
face contorted
clases
into a mask of pure fury. She
y
dug
nada, no sé
frantically
cuánto
into her
tiempo estaré. Además
oversized
de que
designer
el
purse,
año que viene
pulled
tengo
out
que
her
estar, tengo que
smartphone,
acudir al
and jabbed her
50% de las
perfectly
clases. Es
manicured
decir,
fingers against the
que
glass
iré a
screen.
todas las
She
clases,
dialed
porque
911 right in
todas
front of
menos
me,
las
keeping her
próximas a los
hostile gaze locked
exámenes,
onto
porque
my
así tengo el
face. She put
50%
the phone
y
to her
estudio,
ear,
tío.
and the exact
Entonces habrá
second
que
the
estudiar un
emergency
montón, ¿eh?
dispatcher answered,
Chimenea otra
her
vez,
voice
guay.
miraculously
Chimenea,
morphed into
chimenea,
a
vale.
high-pitched
Pues
tremble
eso,
of
tío. Ay, qué
manufactured
miedo,
terror.
tío. Bueno, no pasa nada.
She
Esos
launched into a
problemas de la Teresa del
performance worthy
futuro,
of a
problemas del
daytime
futuro, que
soap
aún no
opera.
estamos ahí,
She
aún
told the
tenemos que hacer el
operator that
examen
her
este.
unhinged and
Nos han
deeply
pasado la
jealous
secoe, nos han
sister-in-law had
pasado lo
just
que nos
broken
van a
into her
hacer.
brand new coastal
Lo
property.
que nos van a hacer,
She
¿sabéis?
claimed I
Como
was
si
violently
fuesen a
trespassing,
matar
screaming at the
lentamente.
top of my
No.
lungs, and
Bueno,
physically threatening the
básicamente,
moving
esta es
crew.
la primera cosa que voy a
She
hacer y
faked a
estoy
terrified
nerviosa. Y aún
sob,
tengo que hacer el
begging the
examen del
dispatcher
viernes,
to
¿vale? Para
send
que veáis
police
lo nerviosa
officers
que me pongo.
immediately
Bueno,
because she felt
básicamente es
incredibly
historia
unsafe
clínica
and feared for her
y
life in her very
exploración.
own home. After she
Básicamente
hung up
son
the
diferentes
phone,
escenarios,
Courtney
vamos
crossed her
pasando
arms tightly over her
todos, en
chest
plan
and
uno en
glared
cada
at me with
sala. Es que
absolute
estoy por aquí los
triumph. She thought she had won the ultimate
Bueno,
victory.
y básicamente nos
She
quedamos
truly
aquí
believed
delante de
that
la
the local
puerta,
police
leemos las
arriving would
instrucciones,
somehow
tenemos un
validate
minuto y
her
medio para
entirely
leer las
fabricated
instrucciones.
reality and
Básicamente lo
force me out
primero
of the
es
house.
entrar y hacer la historia
We had
clínica, que
about
no hace
10 or
falta ir y
15 minutes
escribir la
to wait
historia
before the
clínica
local
aún, o sea, puedes
authorities would show
hacerlo
up,
todo así
and
mal,
Courtney used
porque
every
luego te
single
dejan 10
second of that
minutos para hacer
time
la historia
to
clínica
parrot my
bien.
mother Patricia's
Y
deeply
nada,
toxic
empiezas
rhetoric.
a
She paced back
preguntarle
and
al
forth
actor
across the grand foyer,
porque es un
her
actor
expensive
y tal.
sandals clicking sharply
Hay
against the
actores
marble.
que se
She
dejan hacer la
launched into a
exploración y hay
vicious,
otros que no, que se lo
unyielding
haces al
tirade
maniquí.
meant to break
¿Qué
my
pasa?
spirit
Que
and
el
force me
maniquí,
into
tío, en
submission.
plan, imagínate que tiene
You
un
are
soplo
so
o algo y tú
intensely
estás ahí
bitter,
en plan
Lydia.
escuchando un maniquí que no hace
She spat
ruidos.
out, gesturing wildly with her hands. You are just furious because
Total,
Cameron is the
que nos
one
tenemos que llevar
actually
nuestro propio
carrying on the
exponente. Es que lo
family
nerviosa, es que
legacy.
estoy riéndome
Mom warned us
de
you
lo
would do
nerviosa que
something
estoy.
exactly
Y
like
no
this.
estamos ni en el
She said you
examen.
would try to ruin
Entonces
his
tienes que
big
hacer
moment
exploración y
just
esas
because
cosas,
you are
tío,
miserable
como
and
me hagan
alone
hacer
in your
una
sad little
exploración
corporate life.
neurológica, me
Courtney
voy
stepped
así en plan,
closer,
no, no,
jabbing
no.
her finger
O sea, la
aggressively in
neurológica
my
es un
direction.
coñazo. plan un
You
coñazo, es
have
que es
always
muy
been
larga,
jealous of
tienes
us.
que pedir
Look at
muchas
what you
cosas y
tried
tal,
to
y tienes
do
que
at our
acordarte de
wedding.
todos los pares que
You tried to
añades, y yo en plan,
completely ruin
socorro.
the
Pero
happiest
bueno,
day
habrá
of
que
our
hacerlo, a lo
lives
mejor no lo
by
sé, espero que
refusing
no.
to pay for the
Espero que me
open
toque
bar.
uno así easy
Mom and
peasy,
Dad
¿vale?
had to take out
Y nada,
another
entonces
massive
tienes que hacer
personal
eso y
loan
después
just to cover your
paran,
incredibly
te
selfish
sacan, haces la
behavior.
historia,
You
tienes
have
10 minutos
millions
para
of
hacer la
dollars
historia,
sitting in the
escribirla
bank,
bien,
and
con
you
los
could not even
términos
buy your only brother
médicos,
decent
y
drinks for his
después
wedding guests.
te pasan a otra
Now you
sala
are
con los
trying to steal the
profesores,
beautiful
les
house
das la historia
Mom
clínica y
explicitly
ahí
gave
te
him. You
escupen,
are
te
sick,
dicen,
Lydia. You need serious
esto está
psychiatric
mal,
help. I
esto
stood
está
there
bien,
listening to her,
se te ha olvidado
completely
esto, no sé
unbothered by
qué
her
y tal.
venomous accusations.
Dicen que es
4 years
fácil lo
ago,
del
when they got
tercero,
married, Cameron and
pero tengo
Courtney had
miedo, o
demanded
sea,
I
os
write a
prometo que
check
tengo
for
miedo. Escribirla también
$40,000
o decir,
to
tía,
cover their
escribirla
extravagant
y nos dejan 10
reception.
minutos, no,
When I
no podemos
politely
tener apuntes, no
declined
podemos hacer
offering
nada,
instead to
obviamente.
pay for their honeymoon
Y
flights
eso,
to
entonces
Hawaii,
nada, me
my
quiero
family
revisar
had labeled me a
términos
greedy, heartless
de ese
monster.
mío, en plan,
My parents had indeed taken out a
términos
terrible
en
high
general.
interest personal loan to fund Courtney's top tier open bar and ridiculous ice sculptures.
Acabo de escuchar una señora de la
That
calle, te
same
voy a
reckless
romper la
financial
cabeza.
behavior was exactly why they had faced total
Roberto.
bankruptcy last year, forcing me to step in and buy this house to save them from financial ruin. The sheer irony of Courtney standing in the foyer of the house I bought, claiming I was the one destroying the family legacy, was almost poetic in its
Es una
absurdity. I
señora,
did not argue with her.
es una señora
Arguing with Courtney was
que va
like
con
trying
su
to
perro
reason with
y
a brick
la
wall.
amiga o algo,
It was a
tío.
complete waste of breath and energy. I simply
Nada,
walked
tío,
past
iba
her,
detrás
ignoring
y
her
con el
continuing
bastón
shrieks,
y eso,
and
tío,
headed
estoy
over to the
haciéndolo por
kitchen
eso.
island.
Navidad en el Bronx.
I pulled out one
El
of the
Bronx.
tall, sleek bar
Eso,
stools
no
and
sé qué
sat
es,
down
tío.
calmly.
Me suena, pero no
I
lo
took
sé,
my
tío.
phone out of my pocket and opened my secure
Me dice,
messaging
¿cómo no sabes lo
application.
que es? No sé qué.
I had
Pues
already
sí,
set the cash
seguramente.
sale of the house in
Pero
motion
bueno, si
with
es
my
un barrio
commercial
malo,
broker, but I needed my
en Nueva
corporate
York,
real
ya,
estate
Nueva
attorney
York, pero no me
Donovan
acuerdo
to
de
handle
qué
the
es.
immediate local
Pero bueno,
trespassing issue happening right in front of me. I
bueno,
quickly
no pasa
texted
nada,
Donovan
chicos.
requesting the
Estoy
immediate
viva.
electronic
Significa que
delivery
se
of
puede
the
vivir aquí.
complete legal file for the
Dame un
coastal
beso.
property.
No,
I
aquí no se
typed
lo
out a
habría hecho.
concise
Es que no está
message
Carlos,
explaining
creo.
that my brother was attempting to
Porque
commit mortgage
por la
fraud
latina, tío.
using a forged
No
quitclaim
puede ser.
deed, and that the police were
Pues
currently
nada,
en route to
procedamos
the
al
house.
siguiente descanso.
I
Voy a ir
asked
un momento
Donovan
al
to
baño
send
que
the
me meo
official state registered
y a
articles of
rellenar la botella de
incorporation
agua y
for the
procedamos,
Blind Limited
chicos.
Liability Company and the original
Nosotros
signed
podemos, aunque no
residential
lo
lease
parezca.
agreement.
Así que
Purchasing
ya
this
está, la
estate under a
ludopatía, tío.
blind
En
LLC
honor a
had been the
Carlos.
smartest
Indigo
business
Carlos
decision I
y
had
la
ever made.
ludopatía, tío.
I originally did it
Así
for
que nada,
strict
chicas,
tax
muchísimo
purposes
ánimo. Hola,
and to
Celia.
shield my personal assets from
Muchísimo
any
ánimo.
potential
Nos vemos por
liability.
la tarde. Ay,
Because it
Celia,
was a
pues nos
blind
vemos esta
trust, my
tarde.
parents never saw my
Muchos
personal name on
besos.
any of the
Y
closing
nada, tía,
documents.
descansa.
They only
Así que nada,
interacted with the
chicos, mucho
property
ánimo
management firm I had
y
hired to act as the
procedamos.
intermediary. My parents never owned a single brick, a single window, or a single blade of grass on this property. They had merely signed a standard residential lease agreement, which allowed them to live here rent-free. In their boundless arrogance and entitlement, they had simply assumed the dense legal paperwork they signed was a deed transferring ownership to them because they felt entirely entitled to my wealth. Donovan was incredibly efficient. Within 3 minutes, my phone chimed with a secure email notification. I opened the encrypted files and downloaded the watermarked PDFs directly to my device. I had the state-certified articles of incorporation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole managing member and exclusive owner of the LLC that held the title to the house. I had the certified bank records showing the massive wire transfer for the cash purchase of the property. And most importantly, I had the heavily detailed 50-page lease agreement explicitly signed by both Patricia and Richard, acknowledging they were simply renting the property under my strict corporate terms. The lease strictly forbade them from subletting, assigning the lease, or transferring residency to anyone else. My legal arsenal was fully loaded, organized, and ready to be deployed. I sat quietly at the kitchen counter, casually scrolling through the digital documents, while Courtney continued her unhinged rant in the background. She was loudly boasting to the movers who were still awkwardly standing in the driveway about the luxury vehicles they were going to lease once Cameron's home equity line of credit officially cleared the bank. She talked about hiring a celebrity interior designer to completely gut the master bathroom because the expensive imported Italian marble I had chosen was apparently too depressing for her vibrant personality. I let her talk. I let her dig the hole as deep as possible. Every word out of her mouth only confirmed the absolute delusion my family operated under. The distinct wail of police sirens finally cut through the quiet peace of the suburban neighborhood. The sound grew louder and louder, bouncing off the manicured houses until it abruptly stopped right outside the front doors. I looked through the large front bay windows and saw two local police cruisers pull up hard against the curb, deliberately blocking the commercial moving truck from leaving. Red and blue lights flashed brightly, reflecting off the pristine glass of the front entrance and drawing the attention of several curious neighbors who began peeking out of their front doors. Courtney let out a loud, dramatic gasp the moment she saw the flashing lights. She instantly snapped back into her fragile victim persona. She forced real tears to well up in her eyes, her face crumpling into an expression of profound distress and terror. She snatched the forged, unnotarized piece of paper off the kitchen counter and clutched it tightly to her chest like a protective shield. She sprinted toward the front doors, throwing them wide open and running straight toward the approaching officers. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger back at the house, crocodile tears streaming rapidly down her face. She sobbed hysterically, waving the completely fake deed wildly in the air and screaming at the top of her lungs, demanding that the officers place me in handcuffs immediately and drag me off her property. The two local police cruisers skidded to a halt at the edge of the driveway, their tires biting harshly into the pavement. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the pristine landscaping, instantly shattering the quiet tranquility of the upscale retirement community. Doors opened and heavy boots hit the ground as two uniformed officers approached the house. Courtney did not waste a single second. She practically launched herself off the front porch and sprinted toward the lead officer. She forced a frantic, hysterical sob from her throat, perfectly playing the role of the terrified, victimized homeowner. She thrust the crumpled, unnotarized piece of paper directly into the lead officer's chest. Tears streamed rapidly down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger back at me as I stood calmly on the front steps. She screamed to the officers that her deeply unhinged, violently jealous sister-in-law had just broken into her brand-new coastal property. She claimed I was trespassing, verbally assaulting her and physically threatening the moving crew who were just trying to do their jobs. She demanded that they place me in handcuffs immediately and drag me off her lawn. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern, weather-beaten face, held up a firm hand to stop her frantic screaming. He took the crumpled piece of paper from her shaking hands and stepped back to examine it. He pulled a pen light from his tactical vest and shined it over the document. He flipped the paper over once, then twice, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He was actively looking for a raised county seal, a legitimate notary stamp, or any official municipal tracking number. He found absolutely nothing. It was just a standard template printed from a free legal website, completely devoid of any binding authority. The officer looked back at Courtney, his expression rapidly shifting from professional concern to intense, hardened skepticism. I walked slowly down the front steps, my posture straight and my expression completely neutral. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not shed a single tear. I held my digital tablet out to the second officer who had stepped up to flank his partner. I introduced myself clearly and concisely, stating my full legal name. I informed the officers that I was the sole legal owner of the property and that the woman crying hysterically on the driveway was currently attempting to illegally occupy a corporate asset using a forged document. I tapped the screen of my tablet, opening the encrypted legal file my corporate attorney Donovan had just delivered. I handed the tablet to the lead officer. I presented the official state-certified articles of incorporation for the Blind Limited Liability Company. The digital documents featured secure watermarks and official government timestamps. They proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the managing member and exclusive owner of the LLC that held the full title to the coastal estate. I then pulled up the original residential lease agreement. I explained to the officers that Patricia and Richard Wilson were merely residential tenants. I showed them the specific clauses in the 50-page document that my parents had explicitly signed. The lease strictly prohibited subletting, assigning the lease to a third party, or transferring residency to anyone else. My parents had blatantly broken their lease by attempting an illegal sublet to my brother. The lead officer cross-referenced the signatures on my certified digital lease with the signatures on Courtney's crumpled piece of paper. The reality of the situation dawned on him instantly. The lead officer handed Courtney her piece of paper back. He looked her dead in the eye and informed her in a very flat, authoritative tone that her document was entirely fraudulent. He explained that residential tenants have absolutely zero legal right to deed a property to another person. Courtney stopped crying the exact second the officer spoke. Her manufactured tears instantly dried up, replaced by a deep, furious shade of purple that crept up her neck and settled into her cheeks. She stomped her foot on the driveway, pointing aggressively at my tablet. She shrieked that my documents were fake. She screamed that her mother-in-law had explicitly promised them this house because her husband was the only child actually carrying on the family legacy. The officers ignored her tantrum completely. The second officer turned his attention to the two movers who were standing frozen near the back of their commercial truck. The officer pointed a stern finger at the moving crew. He ordered them to pack everything back into their vehicle immediately. He explicitly warned them that if they carried one more piece of furniture across the threshold of the house, they would be placed in handcuffs and formally charged with aiding and abetting a residential burglary. The movers did not need to be told twice. Wanting absolutely no part of a federal property dispute, they practically sprinted into the grand foyer. They grabbed Cameron's massive, ugly brown leather sectional and hauled it back out to the truck at top speed, leaving scuff marks on the driveway in their haste to retreat. The lead officer turned his attention back to Courtney. He pointed his finger straight down the palm-lined street. He told her she had exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises entirely. He made it crystal clear that if she was still standing on my property, when those 10 minutes expired, she would be arrested for criminal trespassing and attempting to secure a property with fraudulent documentation. Courtney's entitled, smug demeanor shattered into a million pieces. Panic finally set in as she realized the police were not going to enforce her delusion. Her hands shook violently as she dug into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She dialed Cameron's number, frantically pacing in tight circles on the driveway. Cameron answered from the luxury cruise ship, the sounds of clinking glasses and tropical music echoing loudly through the phone's speaker. Courtney practically shrieked into the receiver. She told Cameron that the police were currently kicking her off the property. She cried that the deed Patricia had given them was completely fake, and that I had showed up with actual corporate documents proving I owned the entire estate. Cameron erupted into a blind, vicious rage. The sound of his furious voice projected clearly from the speakerphone, carrying across the quiet suburban street. He demanded that Courtney put the police officer on the phone right that second. Courtney eagerly thrust her phone toward the lead officer, who reluctantly leaned in to listen, his arms crossed tightly over his tactical vest. Cameron began screaming at the officer, his voice dripping with intense arrogance and absolute entitlement. He threatened to sue the entire police department for harassing his wife. He yelled that he was a highly successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur and that the house rightfully belonged to him because his mother said so. He loudly boasted that he was already in the middle of processing a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the property, inadvertently confessing to federal bank fraud right into the ear of a sworn law enforcement officer. Cameron then turned his wrath toward me. He screamed through the phone speaker that I was a lying snake. He yelled that I was just a bitter, jealous spinster trying to steal his rightful inheritance and ruin his massive business launch. He demanded the officers arrest me immediately and hand the house keys over to his wife. The lead officer listened to Cameron's unhinged rant for exactly 15 seconds. Then, with a look of profound disgust, the officer reached out and tapped the red button on Courtney's screen, hanging up on my brother mid-sentence. The sudden silence on the driveway was deafening. The officer handed the phone back to Courtney. He tapped his wristwatch and stared her down. He informed her that she now had exactly 7 minutes left to leave the property before she left in the back of a squad car. Courtney let out a primal scream of pure, unadulterated frustration. She stomped her feet on the driveway like a petulant toddler, hurling a vicious stream of profanities in my direction. When neither I nor the police officers reacted to her outburst, she finally spun around and stormed toward her luxury SUV. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and aggressively keyed the ignition. She sped out of the quiet cul-de-sac, her tires screeching loudly against the pavement as she fled the neighborhood. The movers finished loading the last of the boxes moments later. They secured the back of their commercial truck, offered a quick apologetic wave to the police, and drove away. The property was finally perfectly silent once more. The officers approached me on the front steps, handing back my tablet. They thanked me for my calm cooperation and strongly advised me to contact a locksmith to repair the damaged front door panel. They returned to their cruisers and drove off, leaving me standing alone on the pristine driveway of my reclaimed coastal estate. I walked back into the house and manually locked the heavy glass doors behind me. The grand foyer was empty, but the chaotic intrusion left me feeling unsettled. I needed to thoroughly inspect the property to ensure Courtney and the clumsy movers had not damaged anything during their brief illegal occupation. I walked straight down the hallway and entered the master suite, the exact room where they had been trying to shove Cameron's massive sectional. The room was completely empty, bathed in warm afternoon sunlight filtering through the large bay windows. I paced slowly across the expensive space, keeping my eyes locked on the floorboards. I was actively searching for deep scratches or dents in the custom-imported hardwood. As I stepped near the entrance of the large walk-in closet, my foot suddenly caught on an uneven surface. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing as I barely managed to catch my balance against the heavy wooden doorframe. I looked down at the floor in confusion. One of the polished hardwood planks was visibly loose, its edge slightly elevated above the surrounding boards. I knelt down on the floor and wedged my fingers under the edge of the wood. I pulled upward and the plank lifted away with surprising ease, revealing a dark, intentionally hollowed-out space between the heavy floor joists. I stared into the dark cavity, my pulse quickening. Nestled deep inside the hidden compartment was a heavy metal lockbox. It was a rugged, fireproof security safe, completely covered in a fine layer of dust. It featured a complex mechanical combination dial on the front panel. Attached to the lid was a small, tarnished brass plaque securely riveted to the metal. Engraved deeply into the brass were my father's initials, Richard Wilson. I knelt on the bare hardwood floor and pulled the heavy metal lockbox out from the dark cavity between the joists. The thick layer of dust coated my fingers, but I did not care. I ran my thumb over the tarnished brass plaque reading Richard Wilson. My father had always been fiercely protective of his private financial documents. He frequently lectured me about the importance of securing sensitive paperwork, claiming it was a crucial habit for any successful business owner. Seeing his personal safe hidden under the floorboards of the house I bought for him was jarring but not entirely surprising. I sat cross-legged and pulled the heavy box into my lap. The mechanical dial stared back at me, demanding a 4-digit code. My father was a creature of absolute habit. He was deeply predictable in every aspect of his life. I turned the cold metal dial to the numbers of his wedding anniversary. I pressed the latch, but the box remained firmly locked. I tried the year he started his first manufacturing job. Nothing happened. A quiet, bitter realization settled over me. I spun the dial again, entering the 4 digits that dictated the entire dynamic of our family. 0812, August 12th, Cameron's birthday. The heavy internal mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet room. The thick lid popped open. The sheer predictability of his favoritism was almost laughable. Even in his deepest secrets, my father prioritized his golden child above all else. I pushed the heavy lid all the way back, expecting to find a stash of emergency cash or perhaps my grandmother's missing vintage jewelry. My parents had always claimed those heirlooms were lost during a move, but I had long suspected they pawned them to fund one of Cameron's early ventures. Instead of valuables, the safe was packed to the brim with thick manila folders. The paper smelled stale and old, like the damp basement of our childhood home. I pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Personal Taxes in my father's tight, aggressive handwriting. I flipped it open, expecting to see their joint returns. Instead, my own name jumped off the page. Lydia Wilson. I frowned, pulling the thick stack of papers into the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay windows. These were not simple tax returns. They were comprehensive financial portfolios. I dug deeper into the box, pulling out original bank statements, credit reports, and loan origination documents. The papers were pristine, perfectly preserved in clear plastic sleeves. I opened a thick packet from a major national commercial bank, dated exactly 12 years ago. My eyes scanned the top page, and my heart completely stopped beating. It was a master promissory note for a massive unsecured personal line of credit. The total approved amount was $150,000. The primary borrower listed on the first page was Lydia Wilson. Printed right below my name was my exact social security number, my childhood home address, and a forged signature that vaguely resembled my own handwriting. My hands began to shake violently as I flipped through the rest of the documents. The line of credit had been fully maxed out within exactly 3 weeks of being opened. I stared at the bank transfer receipts, tracking the money as it flowed out of the fraudulent account. The funds were not used for home repairs or medical emergencies. Every single dollar had been systematically wired to a corporate bank account registered to Genesis Tech Holdings. I remembered Genesis Tech Holdings vividly. It was Cameron's very first attempt at becoming a technology mogul. He was 25 years old at the time, convinced he was the next great Silicon Valley visionary. He had rented expensive premium office space, bought luxury corporate vehicles, and completely bankrupted the company within 8 months. My parents had sworn they never gave him a single dime for that ridiculous venture, claiming Cameron had successfully secured private angel investors. The truth was staring me right in the face. My parents were the angel investors, and they had used my stolen identity to fund his entire delusion. A wave of profound, agonizing memory washed over me. I was 22 years old when this loan was taken out. I had just graduated from college, working 80-hour weeks as a junior design assistant, trying to build my staging business from the ground up. I had saved every penny I earned to rent my very first luxury apartment in downtown Boston. I remembered sitting in the leasing office feeling so incredibly proud of myself. The leasing agent had taken my application, run my background check, and then returned to the lobby with a look of deep pity. She handed my application back and told me I was instantly denied. She said my credit score was completely destroyed. She told me I had massive defaulted loans and collections accounts severely damaging my financial profile. I was completely humiliated. I cried the entire train ride back to my parents' house. When I walked through the front door and told them my credit was mysteriously ruined, my mother had actually laughed at me. Patricia had stood in the kitchen sipping her expensive wine and told me I was just financially illiterate. She claimed I probably applied for too many credit cards in college and ruined my own life through sheer stupidity. My father had chimed in, saying I needed to be much more responsible like Cameron, who was actively building a massive tech empire. They watched me sob at the kitchen table. They watched me struggle for years to rebuild a credit profile I never actually destroyed. They watched me get denied for basic business loans and forced to pay exorbitant interest rates on cheap used cars because my score was trapped in the low 500s. They watched me suffer the agonizing real-world consequences of their federal crimes, and they never once showed a single ounce of remorse. They had deliberately ruined my 20s to protect the golden child. They stole my identity, committed massive financial fraud, and then happily gaslit me into believing I was the failure. I sat on the floor of the empty master bedroom, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of my family's ultimate betrayal. Any lingering trace of familial guilt evaporated from my body entirely. The small, tiny voice in my head that had always whispered that maybe I was being too harsh, or maybe they really did love me, went completely silent. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating determination. My parents did not just take advantage of my wealth. They actively stole my future before I even had a chance to build it. They felt entitled to my money now because they had already decided they owned me 12 years ago. I gathered the thick stacks of bank statements, the forged promissory notes, and the wire transfer receipts. I neatly stacked them back into their pristine plastic sleeves and placed them back into the heavy metal lockbox. I closed the lid and spun the dial, locking the criminal evidence away safely. I did not put the box back under the floorboards. I tucked it securely under my arm. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Donovan, my corporate real estate attorney. He answered almost immediately, his voice brisk and professional. He asked if the local police had successfully cleared the trespassers from the property. The police handled Courtney. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. The house is completely empty and secure. The movers are gone. Donovan let out a sharp sigh of relief. Excellent news, Lydia. We can proceed with the standard eviction notices for Patricia and Richard when they return from their cruise. We will have them legally barred from the property by the end of the month. I looked around the beautiful sunlit bedroom. I looked at the pristine hardwood floors and the expensive crown molding I had picked out specifically because my mother said she loved the coastal aesthetic. I had bought this massive house out of a misplaced sense of duty to people who had secretly treated me like a disposable financial asset. I do not want to evict them anymore, Donovan, I said, gripping the heavy metal lockbox tightly against my side. Eviction is far too generous. Donovan paused on the other end of the line. What exactly are you suggesting, Lydia? I walked out of the master suite, my footsteps echoing sharply down the long, empty hallway. I want you to contact Harrison immediately, I instructed. Harrison was the lead buyer for a massive corporate real estate investment group that had been trying to aggressively acquire properties in this specific neighborhood for the past 6 months. He had personally offered to buy this exact house from me before I moved my parents into it. Tell Harrison the coastal property is officially back on the market today, I said, walking through the grand foyer and out the front doors. Tell him he can have the entire estate, including all the premium custom staging furniture, for a pure cash offer. The only absolute condition is a lightning-fast 7-day closing period. Donovan sounded slightly shocked. Lydia, you are talking about selling $1 million asset in less than a week. The corporate group will want immediate possession of the estate. Your parents' personal belongings are still inside the house. I stood on the front porch and locked the heavy glass doors. My parents are on a luxury cruise in the Mediterranean, I replied, stepping out into the bright Florida sun. By the time their ship docks back in the United States, they will not have a home to return to. Initiate the cash sale, Donovan. Accept the offer right now. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my car. I tossed the heavy lockbox onto the passenger seat. The game was officially over. I drove out of the security gates of the coastal community and pulled into the parking lot of a high-end coffee shop just a few miles down the road. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a small corner table, and placed my father's heavy metal lockbox on the chair next to me. The absolute finality of my decision settled over my shoulders like a thick protective armor. For years, I had desperately tried to buy my parents' love and secure their approval by fixing their constant financial disasters. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they had a beautiful place to live. Now, knowing they had deliberately stolen my identity to fund Cameron's delusion and actively ruined my 20s, I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. The emotional chains that had bound me to them were completely severed. My phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was Donovan. He informed me that he had just spoken directly with Harrison, the lead buyer for the corporate real estate investment group. Harrison was highly motivated. His firm had been attempting to corner the luxury market in this specific zip code for months, and my property was the exact crown jewel they needed for their portfolio. Donovan told me Harrison was currently in the area and wanted to tour the estate immediately. I finished my coffee, picked up the lockbox, and drove straight back to the house. Harrison arrived precisely at 3 o'clock in a sleek black town car. He was a sharp, no-nonsense corporate operator dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He stepped out of his vehicle and greeted me with a firm, practiced handshake. He did not ask about my family. He did not ask why I was selling so abruptly, and he certainly did not care about the local police cruisers that had been parked in the driveway just hours prior. He was entirely focused on the asset. We walked through the heavy custom glass front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. Harrison's keen eyes scanned the high ceilings, the pristine white marble flooring, and the expensive crown molding. He noted the flawless condition of the property and the meticulous coastal aesthetic I had curated. He ran his hand along the imported Italian marble of the kitchen island, completely silent, as he mentally calculated the immense value of the estate. He walked through the expansive living areas, inspected the master suite, where I had uncovered the devastating lockbox, and stepped out onto the back patio to observe the manicured landscaping. The entire walkthrough took less than 20 minutes. Harrison turned to face me in the center of the kitchen, his expression strictly business. He told me the property was flawless and that the high-end staging furniture perfectly complemented the architectural design. He did not want to waste time negotiating back and forth. He looked me dead in the eye and offered $1.3 million in pure liquid cash. It was a massive premium over what I had paid just 89 days ago. The corporate group was willing to overpay simply to acquire the asset and secure their foothold in the neighborhood. I stood in the exact spot where Courtney had shrieked her manufactured outrage and calmly considered the tremendous offer. Harrison stated that the cash funds could be wired directly into my corporate accounts, and the entire transaction could be legally closed within a lightning-fast 7-day period. There was only one strict, non-negotiable condition attached to the premium price tag. Harrison pointed a finger at the master suite hallway. He told me that his firm required immediate, undisputed possession of the property. The house had to be completely devoid of all personal belongings by Friday afternoon. The corporate group planned to bring in their own architectural photographers over the weekend, and they could not have any residential clutter interfering with their commercial timeline. If there was so much as a single toothbrush left in the master bathroom, the entire deal would be instantly voided. I looked at Harrison and extended my hand. I told him we had a deal. Donovan had already emailed the preliminary commercial sales agreement to both of us. Harrison pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket and slid the printed documents across the smooth marble surface of the kitchen island. I signed my name with sharp, decisive strokes, completely signing away the property that my parents believed they rightfully owned. The crisp sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the sound of a heavy steel door slamming shut on my family's unearned luxury. I did not waste a single second after Harrison drove away. With the Friday deadline looming, I immediately contacted a premium rapid response, packing, and junk removal service based out of downtown Boston. I paid a massive premium to have a 12-person crew dispatched to the coastal estate that very same evening. I sat on the bar stool in the kitchen, drinking bottled water and orchestrating the total dismantling of my parents' lavish lifestyle. The packing crew arrived in 3 large, unmarked vans. They were efficient professional and asked absolutely no questions about why they were rapidly emptying a $1 million home at 6 o'clock in the evening. I stood in the hallway and directed them to pack every single item belonging to Patricia and Richard. I watched with cold satisfaction as 2 workers carefully wrapped and boxed my father's absurdly expensive custom-tailored golf clubs. He had bragged for months about how those clubs would make him the star of the local retirement country club. Now they were being shoved into heavy-duty cardboard boxes. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and instructed a team of 3 women to clear out every single garment. I watched them pull Patricia's extensive collection of silk resort wear, expensive cashmere sweaters, and high-end designer handbags off the custom velvet hangers. My mother had spent thousands of dollars outfitting herself for her new wealthy persona, using the money she saved by living rent-free in my house. The workers swiftly folded the expensive fabrics and sealed them away in dark plastic shipping bins. They packed up the large, hard-shell cruise luggage boxes my parents had left behind, gathering all the excessive luxury items they had accumulated while secretly viewing me as their personal bank account. The house was systematically stripped bare. The premium staging furniture remained perfectly in place, but every trace of Patricia and Richard Wilson was completely erased from the property. They had treated my home like their own personal kingdom, and now they were being evicted by a team of strangers in matching gray uniforms. I instructed the lead foreman on exactly where the boxes needed to go. I did not send their belongings to a premium luxury storage facility. I had actively researched the cheapest, most basic storage options available in the greater metropolitan area. I rented a dingy, windowless $90 a month climate-controlled unit in a run-down industrial park across town. The facility was surrounded by rusted chain-link fences, and the harsh fluorescent lights in the corridors constantly flickered. It was the absolute stark opposite of the glamorous coastal estate they felt entirely entitled to claim as their own. I followed the moving vans across town in my own car. The sun had completely set by the time we arrived at the bleak industrial park. I stood in the cold concrete hallway and watched the crews stack the heavy brown boxes from floor to ceiling inside the narrow, cramped storage unit. Patricia's designer handbags and Richard's premium golf clubs were unceremoniously piled into the small concrete box alongside their winter coats and cheap knickknacks. The sheer visual poetry of their fabricated wealth being locked away in a cheap metal cage was incredibly grounding. The foreman handed me the clipboard. I signed off on the premium rapid response packing service and handed him a generous cash tip for his crew's speed and discretion. I stood alone in the quiet, flickering hallway of the storage facility. I reached up, grabbed the handle of the heavy corrugated metal roll-up door, and pulled it down with a loud, echoing crash. I snapped a heavy brass padlock through the metal latch, clicking it securely into place. I slipped the small, jagged key into my pocket. My parents' entire lives were now locked inside a 10 by 10 concrete cube. I turned around to walk back to my car. The damp night air felt incredibly refreshing against my face. I had reclaimed my property, sold a massive corporate asset for a huge profit, and completely protected my financial future from further criminal exploitation. Just as I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the storage facility lobby and into the dark parking lot, my cell phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was an international text message. It was from Patricia, sent directly from a port in Greece. The message was typed entirely in frantic, demanding capital letters. "The ship rejected our cards. They won't let us disembark in Athens until we clear a $14,000 bar and excursion balance. Fix this right now." The text message from Patricia glared up at me from the brightly illuminated screen of my cell phone. I stood alone in the dark, damp parking lot of the cheap storage facility, reading the frantic, all-caps demand. I did not type a response. I did not call her back. I simply slid the phone deep into my jacket pocket, walked to my car, and drove home. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my coastal estate, my phone had vibrated 12 distinct times. Patricia was leaving back-to-back voicemails. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and played them on speakerphone. The first voicemail was pure, seething indignation. Patricia demanded to know why my credit card, the one she had explicitly memorized the numbers for, was suddenly declining at the purser desk. She shrieked that she was being publicly humiliated in front of the cruise director and several wealthy passengers she had been trying to impress. The second voicemail escalated to sheer, unadulterated panic. She frantically explained that Cameron and Courtney had conveniently disappeared to the upper viewing decks and were absolutely refusing to answer their cabin phone. By the fifth voicemail, Patricia was outright sobbing into the receiver. She wailed that the Greek port authorities were getting involved, and the ship security explicitly refused to let her or Richard disembark in Athens until their massive $14,000 tab for premium liquor and private guided tours was completely settled. I deleted every single audio file without a shred of guilt. The sheer, staggering entitlement required to rack up a 5-figure bar tab on someone else's dime and then aggressively demand they fix it was beyond comprehension. The next morning, I woke up in my quiet, perfectly empty house. The premium staging furniture remained gracefully in place, but all traces of my parents' toxic presence were securely locked away in that concrete box across town. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and walked out onto the back patio. The Florida sun was already warm, reflecting beautifully off the pristine water of the pool. I sat in a cushioned lounge chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. My phone buzzed loudly against the glass table. It was my father. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, it rang again. I answered it on the third attempt, putting it on speaker and resting it flat on the table. Richard did not bother with a standard greeting. His voice boomed through the small speaker, dripping with that familiar aggressive gaslighting he had weaponized to control me my entire life. "Lydia, stop throwing a tantrum," he barked, his tone laced with absolute unearned authority. "Your brother is embarrassed in front of his wife's sister. The ship staff are treating us like common criminals. Wire the money to the ship's purser immediately, or you are completely cut out of this family's future. Do you understand me? You will not see a single dime of your inheritance." I sat there listening to the man who had actively stolen my identity, threatened to withhold an inheritance that did not even exist. He was still trying desperately to play the role of the wealthy, powerful patriarch, while literally trapped on a boat, unable to pay his own bar tab. He truly believed he still held all the controlling cards. I leaned forward and tapped the red button, ending the call mid-breath. I picked up the phone and opened my text messages. I typed out my response slowly and carefully, ensuring every single word carried the exact heavy weight of 12 years of stolen financial freedom. "I am sorry, Dad," I typed. "I would love to help, but my funds are tied up. Did you know the IRS flags suspicious lines of credit taken out on stolen Social Security numbers? You should probably look into that. Enjoy Athens." I hit send. I set the phone down and took another sip of my hot coffee. The retaliation was completely silent, but I could practically feel the massive shockwave radiating across the Atlantic Ocean. I imagined Richard staring at his glowing screen, reading those exact precise words. I imagined the blood rapidly draining from his face as he realized his ultimate secret, the one he thought he had buried securely under the floorboards of my master bedroom, was entirely exposed. He knew exactly what that text meant. He knew I had found the lockbox. He knew I possessed the promissory notes, the forged signatures, and the highly detailed bank transfers. He knew his entire fabricated life of luxury was built on federal fraud, and I held all the undeniable receipts. For 3 straight hours there was absolute silence from the Mediterranean. No more ringing calls, no more demanding text messages, no more hysterical sobbing voicemails from Patricia. The deafening quiet was the most satisfying sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. Then, right as I was walking back into the kitchen to rinse my coffee mug, my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID flashed Cameron's name. I answered the call, fully expecting another barrage of entitled screaming, or perhaps more empty threats about his imaginary legal prowess. Instead, the voice that came through the speaker was shaking with actual, raw, unfiltered panic. "Lydia, you have to help me." Cameron stammered, his breath catching sharply in his throat. "Please, Lydia. You have to call the bank. You have to tell them the deed is real." His arrogant bravado had completely vanished. He was not a brilliant tech visionary or a highly successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur. He was a terrified 30-year-old man whose entire fabricated house of cards had just violently collapsed. "What are you talking about, Cameron?" I asked, keeping my voice totally detached and perfectly monotone. The bank froze everything, he gasped, sounding like he was pacing rapidly in a small enclosed space. The federal underwriter processing the home equity line of credit ran a deep title search this morning. They flagged the quitclaim deed Mom gave me. They said the notary seal was missing and the property was officially owned by a corporate entity. They froze my entire account, Lydia. Every single checking and savings account is locked down under heavy suspicion of bank fraud. I have zero access to any money. Courtney is crying in the cabin. The ship is demanding immediate payment for the luxury suite, and my cards are all declining. I leaned against the cool marble of the kitchen counter, letting the sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity wash over me. Cameron had actually tried to push a poorly forged deed through a federal banking institution while actively sitting on a cruise ship. He thought he was so much smarter than everyone else that he could just easily bypass standard legal protocols through sheer arrogant entitlement. "You committed mortgage fraud, Cameron," I stated plainly. "You submitted a forged legal document to extract $500,000 against a corporate asset you absolutely do not own. The bank did exactly what they are legally required to do. You have to verify the HELOC." He begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "Just call the underwriter. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Tell them the LLC is yours and you approve the $500,000 line of credit. I will pay you back, Lydia, I swear to God. I will pay you back every single cent with interest when crypto bounces back next quarter. You know my new venture is going to be massive. Just verify the loan so they unfreeze my accounts. He was still living in a complete fantasy world. He genuinely thought a simple friendly phone call could instantly erase federal bank fraud. He thought promising me imaginary future cryptocurrency profits would somehow magically convince me to willingly participate in his criminal enterprise. He had spent his entire life watching our parents bail him out of every single massive failure, and he truly believed I would step in and do the exact same thing. I am not bailing you out, Cameron, I said, my voice ice cold. I am not verifying a fraudulent loan. You and Mom and Dad can sit in that tiny cabin and figure out how to pay your own bills. Do not ever call this number again. I hung up the phone and instantly blocked his contact. I blocked Patricia and Richard as well. They were officially cut off. They were stranded in Greece with no money, no access to credit, and absolutely no way to continue their luxury vacation. They were going to have to face the severe music entirely on their own. I took a deep breath, feeling incredibly light. The fast cash sale of the house was progressing perfectly. The property was empty. The toxic family members were completely neutralized. All I had to do was wait for Harrison's corporate team to finalize the thick paperwork on Friday, and I could walk away from this entire nightmare with a massive financial profit. Exactly 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen. It was Brenda, the lead escrow officer at the title company, handling the cash transaction for Harrison's real estate group. We had spoken earlier that morning to thoroughly confirm the preliminary wire instructions. I answered the call, expecting her to ask a routine standard question about the final closing disclosures. "Hi, Brenda," I said cheerfully. "Is everything set for Friday?" "Lydia, we have a major problem," Brenda said, her voice incredibly tight with professional concern. "I just pulled the updated property records to prepare the final clean title for the corporate buyer. The transaction is completely halted." I stood up straight, my cheerful demeanor instantly vanishing. "What do you mean, halted?" Harrison offered pure cash. "The house is totally empty. I am the sole owner of the LLC. There is no mortgage on the property." "There is no mortgage," Brenda confirmed, sounding deeply stressed. "But there is a brand new mechanic's lien attached directly to the property address. It was officially recorded and actively filed with the county clerk yesterday afternoon." "A lien," I repeated, my mind racing, trying desperately to understand how this was physically possible. "For what?" "I am looking at the formal filing right now," Brenda said, the distinct sound of shuffling papers echoing through the phone. "It is a strict contractor's lien from Apex Luxury Pools and Spas. It is for unpaid construction materials and heavy labor. The total exact amount filed against your property is $85,000. $85,000. The number hit me like a solid physical blow. I had never contacted a pool company. The pool in the backyard was perfectly fine. "Brenda, I have never hired Apex Luxury Pools," I said, my voice rising in sharp panic. "I have never authorized any construction on this property. I have the official work order attached to the lien filing," Brenda replied, reading quickly. "The contract was signed 3 weeks ago. It explicitly authorizes a massive expansion of the existing pool deck, the installation of a custom hot tub, and imported glass tiling. The signature on the work order is Cameron Wilson. He falsely listed himself as the primary resident and authorized managing agent of the property." The room started to spin. While I was busy working and letting my parents live completely rent-free, my brother had secretly hired a luxury contractor to build him a custom hot tub. He had brazenly authorized $85,000 in massive construction modifications to a house he did not own, and he had completely failed to pay the contractor a single dime. He had likely promised the pool company they would be paid in full as soon as his fraudulent home equity loan cleared the bank. Now that his accounts were completely frozen by the federal underwriter, the contractor had panicked and immediately slapped a hard legal lien on my property to protect their unpaid labor. Lydia, you know Harrison's corporate group requires a pristine, perfectly clean title. Brenda warned, her tone incredibly serious. They are not going to absorb an $85,000 contractor dispute. If this heavy lien is not legally cleared and completely removed from the county records by Friday morning, Harrison will pull his $1.3 million cash offer. You will lose the entire sale. I stood in the perfectly empty kitchen staring out the large window at the pool Cameron had tried to illegally expand. He had trapped me, even from a frozen cruise ship cabin in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. His boundless, staggering arrogance was actively destroying my financial future. I had exactly 3 days to figure out how to instantly eliminate an $85,000 legal hold, or the biggest real estate victory of my life would violently collapse into absolute ruin. I ended the call with Brenda and immediately dialed Donovan. My corporate attorney picked up on the first ring, and his usual brisk professionalism was entirely replaced by an urgent, demanding tone. He had already seen the emergency notification hit the title registry, and he was absolutely furious on my behalf. He did not mince words. He told me Harrison was a corporate shark who dealt exclusively in clean assets and zero liabilities. Harrison's firm was buying a premium piece of coastal real estate, not a messy family legal dispute involving fraudulent construction contracts. Donovan warned me that I had exactly 48 hours to make the mechanic's lien completely disappear. If the title was not perfectly clear by Thursday afternoon, Harrison would walk away from the deal, keep his massive cash offer, and likely blacklist my staging company from any future corporate contracts. I told Donovan to prepare a draft for a sworn legal affidavit regarding contract fraud and text it to my phone immediately. I grabbed my keys and headed straight for my car. I was not going to let Cameron's boundless delusion cost me over $1 million. Apex Luxury Pools and Spas was located in a high-end commercial district just outside the city limits. The drive took exactly 40 minutes, and I used every single second to ruthlessly calculate my leverage. For years, I had watched Cameron operate exactly like this. He would swagger into rooms making grandiose promises, writing checks his bank accounts could never cash, and leaving a trail of furious vendors in his wake. Our parents had always scrambled to cover his tracks, claiming he was just an ambitious visionary who occasionally overextended his creative reach. They had constantly demanded I bail him out of his early missteps, using the hard-earned profits from my boutique staging business. I had spent my entire 20s carrying heavy furniture up narrow staircases, dealing with demanding real estate agents, and building a bulletproof industry reputation through sheer exhausting labor. I knew exactly how contractors operated. I knew their margins were tight, their schedules were brutal, and their tolerance for wealthy frauds was absolutely zero. I pulled into the polished concrete parking lot of the pool company and walked directly through the heavy glass double doors. The showroom was expansive and filled with high-resolution digital displays of infinity pools and custom grottos. I bypassed the receptionist and walked straight toward the back offices, looking for the person in charge. A burly man with thick graying hair and an exhausted expression stepped out of a glass-walled office. His embroidered polo shirt identified him as Marcus, the owner. I introduced myself as Lydia Wilson, the sole legal owner of the coastal property he had just placed a massive lien against. Marcus immediately crossed his arms and his face flushed with deep, aggressive anger. He told me he did not care who technically owned the property. He launched into a furious tirade about my brother. He explained that Cameron had strutted into his showroom 3 weeks ago wearing a bespoke suit and acting like he owned the entire coastal neighborhood. Cameron had demanded an expedited timeline for a luxury grotto, complete with imported glass tiles, smart temperature controls, and a cascading waterfall feature. Marcus said Cameron had confidently signed the work orders authorized the massive $85,000 build, and then completely vanished when it came time to pay the mandatory $20,000 deposit. Marcus had already ordered the custom materials and scheduled his heavy machinery. When Cameron stopped answering his calls, Marcus did what any smart
Me pongo
contractor would
aquí,
do.
es que a lo mejor es
He
el
protected his
no es
business by
el
slapping a heavy lien on the
no sé,
house to ensure he was fully compensated for his financial exposure. I stood
qué
perfectly
cosas más
still and let
raras,
Marcus vent his entirely justified rage.
No
When
sé,
he
yo soy
finally took a
mejor, tío.
breath,
Lo voy a
I
partir,
looked
lo voy a
him dead in
contender.
the eye and laid out my terms.
No sé, tío.
I
Es que
told him I ran one of the
raro,
most
tío.
successful
Este micro
boutique
también lo
staging firms in
tiene
the state.
Marta y le
I
funciona
named,
bien. Yo no
dropped
entiendo
3
nada.
massive commercial developers I frequently partnered with. Marcus instantly recognized the names. The aggressive posture slowly melted from his shoulders as he realized he was speaking to an industry peer, not another delusional scam artist trying to avoid a bill. I explained that Cameron had committed blatant fraud. He had absolutely zero legal authority to authorize construction on my property. He had forged his status as the managing agent to secure the contract. I told Marcus that litigating the $85,000 lien would tie his company up in expensive legal battles for years, and he would likely never see a single dime because Cameron's accounts were currently frozen by federal investigators. However, I offered him an immediate, extremely profitable alternative. I opened my designer tote bag and pulled out my corporate checkbook. I offered to write him a cashier's check for $20,000 right there on the spot. I would pay the missing deposit out of my own pocket to cover his sunk costs, the custom glass tiles, and his wasted time. In exchange, he had to log into the county portal and release the lien immediately. But there was one final non-negotiable condition. I pulled out my phone and forwarded him the drafted legal affidavit Donovan had sent me. I told Marcus he had to sign the sworn document officially stating that Cameron Wilson had fraudulently misrepresented himself and illegally signed the work orders. Marcus read the digital document carefully. He looked at the blank check sitting on his desk. A grim, satisfied smile spread across his face. He printed the affidavit, signed his name with a heavy black pen, and handed it to me. I wrote the check for $20,000 and slid it across the desk. Within 15 minutes, Marcus had his office manager electronically submit the lien release to the county clerk. The legal
Constante.
erasure of my parents'
Claro, ahora
completely
funciona.
fabricated life
Pero
was
ahora va a
officially
funcionar la cámara,
underway.
tío.
By Thursday
Mira, yo
morning,
estoy
Donovan
flipando en
called to
estos
confirm the
instantes.
title was completely clear. The heavy, suffocating cloud of Cameron's
Vale,
fraud had been
ya está,
entirely
¿no?
burned away
Vale.
by my
Ahora sí,
$20,000
tío.
strategic strike. I had the sworn affidavit
Ha
safely
pasado que
locked in
creo
my
que he
digital vault,
desconectado
providing me
la
with
cámara,
absolute
o no lo
bulletproof
sé.
leverage against
No sé
any
qué he
future
hecho, la verdad.
retaliation my brother might attempt to launch.
Ya está,
Friday morning arrived
solucionado.
with brilliant,
Mira,
blinding
los
sunshine. The lightning
literalmente
fast
ha
7-day
colapsado, ha dicho, ya
close
no puedo más con
proceeded
la vida, tío.
flawlessly.
Pues literalmente lo que he hecho ha
Harrison's
sido
corporate
lo
real
típico de
estate
las
group
señoras,
wired the
apagar y
funds
volver a enchufar.
directly to the title
Esto,
company
tío.
without a single delay or
Pues nada, contadme
complication.
qué tal, cómo
I
estáis,
sat in
tío.
Donovan's sleek downtown office,
Yo estoy
drinking
aquí, tío,
sparkling
os
water
prometo
and signing the
que en
final
estos
stack of
momentos es
closing
como
disclosures. The moment the
necesito
escrow
verlo.
officer confirmed the wire transfer, I checked my corporate
No
banking
suben nada, tío.
application. $1.3 million sat securely in my
Ya está.
account. The
Existiendo,
property
tío.
was officially sold.
Ya,
My
es que
parents'
existiendo
massive
al final.
sprawling house of lies was
Pues me he
completely
comprado unas
gone.
chanclas
I returned to my
porque,
own luxury apartment
¿sabéis lo que hice
overlooking
el
the
año
city
pasado?
skyline. I
El año
opened my
pasado
laptop and
terminó
methodically
verano y
erased
dije,
their
voy a guardar
entire
las
existence
chanclas.
from my
Y no
financial
encontraba una.
ecosystem.
Estuve semanas sin
I
encontrarla
logged
y
into
dije,
the
bueno, pues voy
utility
a tirar la
portals
chancla
and
porque es que si
immediately
no la
terminated the
encuentro,
water power
bueno, la
and
encuentro un
high-speed
mes más
internet
tarde. Y yo,
services at the
es que no sé
coastal
para qué tiro la
estate.
otra chancla. Entonces
I
tiré unas
canceled the
chanclas
premium
perfectamente en buen
landscaping
estado de
contract
Primark.
and the
Y nada,
weekly pool
entonces
maintenance.
me he comprado unas porque
Then
estoy
I
yendo con
officially
zapatillas de casa
unregistered
de
my
estas
parents' residential
calentitas que
lease
las voy a tener
agreement,
que poner a lavar
completely
porque me suda
severing
el
their
pie,
legal
obviamente,
ties
con
to
la
the
calor que
property.
hace. Y
I
me llegan hoy.
navigated to the Postal
Estoy
Service
feliz.
website
No recordaba
and
lo bien que
submitted a
suena, me estoy
permanent change of address form
total.
for
Y con
Richard and
el calor
Patricia
que hace,
Wilson.
tío.
I did not
Débora,
forward
no es
their
por
mail
nada,
to my
Ángela tiene la
apartment.
plantita y tú no.
I
Débora, algo
forwarded
estás
every
haciendo
single
mal.
piece of their mail
Me hace
directly
mucha
to the
gracia, tío.
dingy,
Es que
windowless,
Débora no consigue
$90 a
nada.
month
No consigue el
climate-controlled storage unit in the
Está todos los
rundown
días en todos
industrial
los
park.
canales de todo el
Their
mundo,
expensive
tío.
catalogs,
Yo
their
sí lo
cruise line
recordaba.
brochures, and their inevitable past-due credit card bills would now be delivered straight to the cold concrete box that held the remnants of
Adoro,
their
tío.
stolen luxury. The next week passed
pues
in
nada.
blissful absolute
Pues vamos
silence.
a ver si...
I
Mira,
focused
tío, si pongo
entirely on
así,
my
ya no veis
staging
la
business,
botella.
securing 2 massive new commercial
Tía, es
contracts
aleatorio.
and watching my corporate accounts grow steadily.
Débora debería tener ya
I did
una
not think
plantación
about the
con la de
Greek
oro y se
port
pasa
authorities
total. Ay,
or the
el Paul.
frozen home equity line of
Totalmente.
credit. I was
Totalmente.
entirely free from the exhausting burden of
Aleatorio.
managing my family's constant manufactured catastrophes.
Música,
Then, on the evening of the
lluvia,
14th day, my cell phone lit up on my kitchen counter.
chimenea,
The Mediterranean cruise was officially over.
ruido,
The
color,
message was from Patricia. We had to
vidrio, que
borrow
casi se
money
me
from Aunt
olvida.
Carol
Y
just
han
to buy
devuelto
economy
sin...
tickets home. We are exhausted and furious. Have dinner
Pongo la
ready at the
encuesta 2
house at
minutos
7 p.m.
porque
so we can
faltan
discuss your
3.
punishment. The blazing Florida sun beat
Está en
down
fase de pruebas
mercilessly
en
on the
Twitch,
regional airport
por lo que he
tarmac.
leído.
Patricia,
Ostras.
Richard, and Cameron dragged themselves through the sliding glass doors of the arrivals
Todo
terminal,
decorativo.
looking
Me
absolutely
encanta.
nothing like the wealthy elite they desperately pretended to
Me ha
be.
escrito mi tía, hostia,
Their
cuánto
skin was
tiempo.
peeling and burnt an angry
Le tengo
lobster
que
red from
escribir y
being
llamar.
stranded in
Me
Greece
odia
without
tanto.
access to their
Un
premium indoor
poquito,
cabanas.
un poquito.
They were
Pero
wearing
bueno,
cheap,
no
wrinkled
pasa
tourist
nada, tía,
clothing
no
they had
pasa
been forced to buy
nada.
with borrowed cash. The sheer humiliation of flying for 14 hours in cramped economy seats
Aún
next
queda
to the
un pomodoro,
restrooms had
chicas.
completely fractured Patricia's
Un
fragile
muchito.
ego. She was
Me
practically
encanta,
vibrating
tío.
with
Es
toxic
que no sé qué
rage,
contaros,
snapping at
chicas. O
every
sea, como
passing
que
traveler
quiero
who
contaros algo,
dared to
pero no sé
walk
qué
too close
contaros,
to her.
¿sabéis? O sea,
Richard
he
trailed
llamado a mis
behind her,
padres
pulling a
y mis
single
padres súper
battered
contentos.
carry-on
Mi
bag.
padre se le ha
His
saltado una
usual
lagrimilla, mi
commanding
padre nunca
patriarch
llora, tío.
persona was entirely
Y nada,
deflated.
tío, y mi
He
mami
looked like
súper
a
contenta
tired, beaten
pasando
old man.
Me ha hecho gracia. Y de
Cameron
repente
was
mi
in even
padre,
worse
hay
shape.
gente que quiere
He had
hablar
spent the
contigo,
entire
tío.
transatlantic
Y yo,
flight
plan,
sweating
vale.
profusely
Y
and
de repente
aggressively
dos
biting his
señoras que me estaban
fingernails.
hablando. O sea, una
His
la
phone
conozco,
had been dead
obviamente,
for
y
2
otra
days, and the
que no he hablado con
terrifying
ella
reality
desde
of
hace
his
yo que sé
frozen
cuánto
bank
tiempo que no me
accounts
acordaba.
was slowly eating him
Y me ha
alive.
hecho muchísima gracia, de
They
verdad.
emerged onto the humid
Y eso.
sidewalk where Courtney was already waiting for them.
Bueno, Débora,
Courtney had been
tienes
forced to
el
take a
emblema
cheap
de mal
shuttle
por
to
lo
the
menos.
airport
Siempre que
after
te
the
quieres
local
en
police had
esto.
formally evicted her from the coastal
Algo
estate
es
days
algo, algo
earlier.
tenías que conseguir,
She
¿no?
was
De haber
standing
estado
by the
tanto en los
curb,
streams.
clutching 2 massive garbage bags filled with the few
Maldita
personal
platita, es
items
que es buenísima.
she had
Además, ya,
managed to
tío.
grab
Es
before the officers
preciosa.
threatened her with trespassing
Ay,
charges.
es que pone,
When she
o
saw
tienes que ver
Cameron
un
walking
clip
out of
de
the
estos
terminal, she did not
viral,
run
de
to hug
estos, o
him.
que se esté
She
muy
threw the heavy
demandado, o 3
plastic
veces en
bags
un
onto the
stream.
concrete and began
Pero es
screaming.
que Débora lo está
She
haciendo todos
demanded
los
to
días,
know why she
literalmente,
had
por la
been
mañana y por la tarde,
humiliated by
tío.
law
Nada, nos lo
enforcement
quitan a
while
todos,
he
¿no
was
te
off drinking
imaginas?
premium champagne on a luxury
¿Qué
cruise.
hacéis? Pues yo creo que ellas
Cameron
existen.
flinched under
Me
her
vi
verbal
80
assault,
clips.
completely lacking the arrogant
Chimenea.
energy he
Mira que has
usually
puesto la
used to silence
chimenea,
her.
tío, con el calor
Richard
que
stepped
hace.
between them,
Me
his
hacéis
face
mucha
turning a
gracia.
dark,
A
dangerous
mí
shade
solo
of
me cuenta
purple.
clips.
He ordered Courtney to shut her mouth
No
and
puede
get into
florecer
the
más, o sea, se
vehicle.
queda así, en
He
el
had
emblema
ordered a
fluorescente de
rideshare
nivel
using the
4.
last $50 of Aunt Carol's
Qué
pity money.
cosas de la vida,
The
tío.
vehicle that pulled up was not a sleek black town car. It was a dented,
Me
compact
vi casi todos
sedan
tus
that
clips,
smelled
pero los
strongly
míos
of
a lo
cheap
mejor no son
air
los míos
freshener and
tampoco son
stale
súper
cigarette
mega...
smoke.
Yo aquí no
The 4 of
soy
them were forced to cram
streamer
themselves into the
profesional de
tiny back
momento.
seat and passenger area. Patricia sat with her
Ay,
knees pushed up against her
pues
chest,
no os voy a
loudly
decir nada
complaining
aún,
about
tío,
the
pero
lack of
para
legroom,
septiembre
and
Falta y yo tenemos
declaring
pensado
that
muchas
Lydia
cosas
was
para
going
los
to
streams
pay
de
for
Twitch. O
every
sea,
single second of this
ya lo
agonizing
veréis, ya lo
discomfort.
veréis.
The cramped
Obviamente, más
vehicle
sorteo, vídeos
merged
y
onto the busy
cosas y
highway
esas
heading toward
cosas.
the coastal
Y este sorteo de
community.
aquí, que parece que no se vaya a
Cameron
terminar
finally
nunca,
managed to
nada,
plug
yo voy
his
a
dead cell phone
hacer...
into a portable charger he had
me voy a
borrowed
abrir
from
más.
Courtney. The
Nada,
screen
si
lit up and
llegamos
instantly
durante el
began
verano, que no
vibrating
creo,
with
porque la gente
dozens
no
of
creo que
missed
vaya a
call
seguir mi cara de que no
notifications.
lo estoy haciendo nada.
Before he could even
Pero bueno,
check
en
his
Instagram sí que
voicemail,
subiré
the
cosas y
phone
tal. Si
rang
en verano
loudly
de
in the
repente
small,
llegamos por
confined
la
space of
cara,
the car.
obviamente hago
The
el
caller
sorteo.
ID
Y
displayed
si
an
no, ya pues en
out-of-state area
septiembre.
code.
Y tenemos muchísimas
Cameron
cosas
answered
pensadas,
it,
tío.
pressing the speaker to his ear
Tengo
with a
ganas, pero a la vez
trembling
no, porque si
hand.
no sería
The
pasar el
voice on
verano
the other
rápido.
end
Y
of
no
the
queremos
line
que
was
el verano pase
incredibly
muy
sharp
rápido, la
professional
verdad. Hace
and
como un directo
entirely
en verano.
devoid of any customer service warmth.
Claro, para
It
jugar
was
al
a
coco.
senior federal investigator
No es
calling
mala, no es
directly from the
mala.
fraud
Lo
division
pensaré,
of
lo
Cameron's
pensaré.
primary banking institution.
Depende de lo que me des,
The
Débora.
investigator
Si me
stated
das
that the
100
call was
euros,
being
yo te hago el
officially
stream. No, es
recorded
broma.
for federal compliance
Pues
and
nada,
demanded that
chicos, vamos a
Cameron
proceder
verify
otra
his
vez a
identity.
estudiar el último
Cameron
pomodoro de la
stammered his
mañana, a ver si
confirmation,
conseguimos
his
avanzar
eyes
lo
darting
mucho que queremos
frantically
avanzar.
around the cramped vehicle.
Chavillo.
The
Es un
investigator did
parajugar
not
total,
waste a
tío. O
single
sea, aquí hay que
second.
sobornar.
He formally notified Cameron that
Así que
all of
nada,
his
chicos.
personal and business accounts
Muchísimo
were
ánimo y
permanently
nos vemos en
locked,
50
pending a
minutillos.
massive federal
Ay, Ángela,
review.
muchísimas
The
gracias por haber
investigator
estado
listed the
aquí.
exact charges
Espero que
with
tengas un
ruthless
muy buen día. No
precision:
sé si nos vemos
wire
después, pero
fraud,
bueno, si nos vemos
interstate
genial y si
forgery,
no, pues
fraudulent
mucho ánimo.
application for a home equity line of
Y nada,
credit.
muchos besos. Te
The
invitaba
bank
a
had
veces.
received
Me
a
lo pagaste
sworn
todo,
legal
Tren y
affidavit
todo,
explicitly stating that Cameron had forged a
Nada, chicas,
quitclaim deed
muchísimo
across
ánimo.
state lines and illegally authorized discussed a massive construction contract on a property he did not legally own. The color instantly drained from Cameron's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He desperately tried to activate his usual charm offensive. He laughed nervously and told the federal investigator that this was all just a massive family misunderstanding. He claimed his sister owned the corporate entity, and she had simply forgotten that she gave him verbal permission to expand the pool deck. He promised to have Lydia call the bank and clear everything up by the end of the business day. The federal investigator completely shut him down. He informed Cameron that verbal permission did not legally validate a forged state document. Furthermore, the investigators stated that the sworn affidavit they received was provided directly by the primary property owner and the defrauded construction contractor. Lydia had not just ignored his desperate pleas for help. She had actively and meticulously provided the federal authorities with the exact evidence they needed to build a criminal case against him. The investigator told Cameron to retain legal counsel immediately and abruptly ended the call. The silence inside the cheap ride-share was absolutely deafening. Patricia turned her sunburned face toward her golden child, her mouth hanging slightly open. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together audibly. Courtney let out a sharp, cruel laugh from the front seat and muttered that she was married to a broke criminal. Cameron dropped his phone into his lap. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the walls of his massive delusion finally caved in. He realized that Lydia was not just throwing a temporary tantrum. She had methodically dismantled his entire life. She had burned his fraudulent empire to the ground and handed the ashes directly to the federal government. He was facing actual prison time, and there was absolutely no way his parents could bail him out. Patricia refused to accept the reality of the situation. Her mind simply could not process the fact that her obedient, disposable daughter had utterly defeated them. She violently shook her head and declared that the bank investigator was wrong. She shrieked that Lydia was just bluffing and that once they arrived at the house, she would personally force Lydia to call the bank and fix this entire mess. Patricia demanded the driver go faster. She was entirely consumed by the need to enact her brutal punishment. She truly believed that if she just screamed loudly enough, the universe would magically bend back to her will. The battered sedan finally turned off the main highway and entered the exclusive coastal neighborhood. The manicured lawns and towering palm trees stood in stark contrast to the miserable, humiliated family trapped inside the tiny car. The driver pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the luxury estate and parked near the grand front entrance. Richard handed the man the remaining crumpled cash, and the family climbed out of the vehicle. Their cheap suitcases hit the pristine brick pavers with a dull thud. Patricia did not even wait for the others. She marched directly up the walkway, her posture rigid with toxic entitlement. She reached the massive custom glass front doors and aggressively jabbed her personal access code into the digital smart lock keypad. She fully expected the heavy internal mechanism to click open and grant her entry to the kingdom she believed she rightfully owned. The keypad flashed a harsh, solid red light. The locking mechanism remained completely silent. Patricia scowled and punched the numbers in again, hitting the digital buttons with angry, forceful strikes. The lock flashed red a second time. She let out a frustrated growl and yelled for Richard to come open the door. Richard lumbered up the steps, his face dripping with sweat, and shoved Patricia aside. He entered his own master code. The machine blinked red. He tried Cameron's code. Red again. The digital smart lock had been completely wiped and reprogrammed. They were officially locked out of the estate. Patricia's face twisted into a mask of pure unhinged fury. She began pounding her fists against the thick, reinforced glass, demanding that Lydia open the door immediately. She screamed that she was not going to stand outside like a common beggar. When nobody answered her demands, she cupped her hands around her face and pressed her nose directly against the custom glass to peer into the grand foyer. What she saw completely shattered her remaining grip on reality. The massive crystal chandelier still hung from the vaulted ceiling. But everything else was entirely wrong. The expensive premium coastal staging furniture she had meticulously chosen to impress her friends was completely gone. The imported silk rugs, the plush white sofas, and the expensive abstract artwork had all vanished. The pristine, elegant interior had been replaced by a chaotic maze of heavy brown cardboard moving boxes and cheap generic plastic furniture. Patricia's eyes darted wildly across the open floor plan until she looked toward the formal dining room. Sitting exactly where Patricia used to host her lavish dinner parties was a completely unfamiliar family. A man in a faded t-shirt, a woman with her hair pulled up in a messy bun, and two young children were sitting around a cheap folding table eating delivery pizza directly out of the cardboard box. They were laughing and talking, completely unaware of the hysterical woman staring at them from the front porch. Patricia's mind violently rejected the visual information. She refused to comprehend that the house had been sold right out from under her feet. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysterical desperation. She pounded both of her fists against the heavy glass doors with such extreme force that her knuckles began to bleed. The family inside the dining room suddenly stopped eating and turned their heads toward the front entrance, their eyes widening in shock at the sight of the unhinged, sunburned woman attacking their new home. Patricia kept screaming and thrashing against the locked doors as the total devastating reality of her absolute ruin finally crushed her. She slammed her bleeding knuckles against the reinforced glass, leaving frantic red smears across the pristine surface. Her lungs burned as she shrieked, demanding the strangers inside vacate her property immediately. The family sitting at the dining table simply stared at her in stunned silence. The man in the faded t-shirt set his slice of pizza down and pulled his phone from his pocket, completely ignoring her hysterical demands. Richard rushed up the concrete steps and grabbed Patricia by the shoulders, physically pulling her away from the door. He hissed at her to lower her voice frantically, glancing around the quiet, manicured street. He was utterly terrified of looking like a fool in front of the wealthy neighbors he had spent the last 3 months trying to impress. Patricia violently shoved his hands away. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a tangled mess sticking to her sunburned face in sweaty clumps. Her eyes were wide and manic, entirely unhinged from reality. She reached into her cheap souvenir tote bag and retrieved her cell phone. Her hands shook so violently she dropped the device twice on the brick pavers before finally managing to dial the 3 digits of emergency dispatch. "I need police at my house immediately," Patricia screamed into the receiver, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet street. "We have a massive home invasion. There are dangerous squatters inside my luxury estate. They have locked us out and stolen everything. Send a SWAT team. Send everyone. They are eating pizza in my dining room." Richard grabbed his own hair in sheer panic, realizing Patricia was actively filing a false police report, but he was completely powerless to stop her manic spiral. Cameron remained frozen on the meticulously trimmed lawn. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the grass, clutching his dead cell phone to his chest. He was completely trapped in his own private nightmare, replaying the federal investigators' terrifying threats over and over in his mind. Courtney leaned against the trunk of the dented rideshare vehicle, crossing her arms and watching the entire spectacle with a cold, twisted grin. She loudly announced that she hoped the police arrested all of them so she could finally get a peaceful night of sleep. The suffocating Florida heat beat down on the driveway as the minutes ticked by. The upscale 55-plus community was usually a haven of absolute silence and enforced tranquility. Now front doors up and down the street began to slowly open. Wealthy retirees in expensive golf attire stepped out onto their manicured lawns, drawn by the sound of Patricia's relentless shrieking. They murmured to one another, pointing directly at the sunburned, disheveled family, causing a massive public disturbance. Richard tried to offer a pathetic, reassuring wave to a man he had previously bragged to at the country club, but the neighbor simply turned his back and walked inside. The social death Richard feared more than anything else was happening right in front of his eyes. The distant wail of sirens pierced the humid afternoon air. The sound grew rapidly louder until 2 large police cruisers turned sharply onto the street. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly against the manicured palm trees. The heavy vehicles aggressively jumped the curb and skidded to a halt directly in the sweeping circular driveway, blocking the cheap rideshare sedan from leaving. 4 uniformed officers jumped out of the cruisers instantly. Their hands hovered cautiously over their duty belts, reacting to the high-priority home invasion dispatch Patricia had maliciously fabricated. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, commanded everyone to step away from the front entrance. Patricia immediately ran toward him, waving her arms frantically and pointing at the custom glass doors. "Arrest them!" she wailed, her voice hoarse and broken. Break the door down and drag them out in handcuffs. They are stealing my retirement home. They stole all my designer furniture. The officer held up a hand instructing her to remain silent while his partner approached the front entrance. Before the second officer could even knock, the heavy front door swung smoothly open. Harrison stepped out onto the porch. He was no longer wearing his sharp charcoal corporate suit. He was dressed in casual weekend clothes, holding a half-eaten slice of pepperoni pizza in his left hand. He looked completely unbothered by the flashing police lights and the hysterical woman screaming on his lawn. He simply looked deeply annoyed that his family dinner had been interrupted by neighborhood lunatics. The lead officer stepped forward and asked Harrison to identify himself and explain his legal right to occupy the residence. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not act defensive. He calmly reached into his back pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and handed his state identification to the officer. "I am the legal owner of this property," Harrison stated, his voice carrying the absolute unshakable confidence of a man who dealt in million-dollar corporate acquisitions daily. "I purchased this estate in a pure cash transaction. We formally closed yesterday morning. My firm holds the absolute clean title, and we took immediate possession of the asset." Patricia let out a guttural sound of pure denial. She lunged forward, trying to push past the police officers to get to Harrison. "He is lying," she screamed, spitting the words out with toxic venom. "My daughter bought this house for me. It belongs to us. He is a criminal squatter." Harrison sighed heavily, taking a slow bite of his pizza. He turned his head and called back into the house, asking his wife to bring his leather briefcase to the door. A moment later, the woman with the messy bun stepped out and handed him a thick manila folder. Harrison extracted a crisp, newly printed document featuring heavy notary seals and official county clerk stamps. He handed the pristine paperwork directly to the lead police officer. "Here is the legally recorded deed," Harrison said, entirely ignoring Patricia's existence. "You will see it was formally transferred from Lydia Wilson's corporate entity directly to my holding firm. The transaction is completely bulletproof. Now, if you do not mind, I would like these trespassers permanently removed from my property so my children can finish their dinner in peace." The lead officer carefully reviewed the certified deed cross-referencing the names and the official seals. He handed the document back to Harrison with a respectful nod. The officer turned around and faced Patricia and Richard. His previous cautious demeanor was instantly replaced by a hard, uncompromising glare. "Ma'am, you filed a false report of a violent home invasion," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave. "This is a civil matter, and you have absolutely zero legal right to be on this property. The rightful owner has asked you to leave. You need to gather your belongings and vacate the premises immediately, or you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Patricia's jaw dropped. She looked at Richard, expecting him to unleash his commanding patriarch fury and fix the situation. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate the armed police officer. He lowered his voice into his deepest, most authoritative register, completely ignoring the fact that he was wearing a wrinkled tourist shirt and sporting a peeling sunburn. "Now listen here, officer," Richard blustered, pointing a thick finger at Harrison. "There has clearly been a massive administrative error. My daughter Lydia handles our finances. She would never sell our home without consulting me. I demand you let us inside while I make a phone call to clear this up." The officer did not flinch. He placed his hand firmly on his duty belt and took a deliberate step toward Richard. "I will not ask you again, sir. Step off the property right now." Cameron suddenly scrambled up from the grass, his sheer panic temporarily overridden by his desperate need to sound like the smartest person in the room. He marched up to the police officers, aggressively waving his hands in the air. He tried to deploy the pseudo-legal tech bro jargon he usually used to confuse investors. "You cannot legally force us to leave," Cameron declared, his voice cracking slightly. "We maintain an equitable interest in this property. I hold a secondary quitclaim deed establishing my partial ownership. This cash sale is completely fraudulent. You have to honor our squatters' rights until a federal judge reviews the title chain." The lead officer looked at Cameron like he was a complete idiot. "Squatters' rights do not apply to people standing in a driveway with luggage," the officer stated bluntly. And if you are claiming to hold a secondary deed to a property that was just legally sold free and clear, I highly suggest you contact a lawyer instead of arguing with the police. Now move." Cameron opened his mouth to argue further, but a sudden sound cut through the heavy, humid air. The distinct low hum of a high-end luxury engine echoed down the street. A sleek, immaculate black town car glided smoothly up to the curb, parking directly behind the flashing police cruisers. The tinted windows rolled up tight, reflecting the afternoon sun. The driver, wearing a dark suit, stepped out and quickly moved to open the rear passenger door. I stepped out of the vehicle. I was not wearing wrinkled tourist clothes. I was dressed in a sharp, flawlessly tailored navy blue suit, holding a slim leather portfolio. I looked rested, wealthy, and entirely in control. Donovan, my corporate attorney, stepped out from the opposite side of the car, buttoning his suit jacket and adjusting his expensive silk tie. The stark visual contrast between my pristine professional appearance and my family's disheveled, sunburned misery was absolute perfection. Patricia's manic eyes locked onto me the second my expensive heels hit the pavement. Her expression instantly morphed from sheer terror back to aggressive, entitled demands. She genuinely believed that her personal ATM had finally arrived to fix the glitch and restore her unearned luxury. She broke away from Richard and sprinted across the lawn toward me, her cheap sandals sliding on the wet grass. "Lydia!" Patricia shrieked, waving her arms frantically. "Tell them, Lydia! Tell these stupid officers that you bought this house for us. Show them the real papers. Tell them to arrest that man and let us back inside our home right now." She reached out, intending to grab my arm and pull me toward the police officers. Donovan stepped smoothly between us, blocking her path entirely. He held up a hand, projecting the exact same unshakable authority that Harrison had displayed minutes earlier. "Do not touch my client!" Donovan warned, his voice sharp and cold. I ignored Patricia completely. I did not look at Richard, who was staring at me with a mix of shock and rising fury. I did not look at Cameron, who had suddenly gone entirely silent, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that I held the power to send him to federal prison. I walked calmly past my hysterical mother and approached the lead police officer. I offered him a polite, professional smile. "Officers," I said, my voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of any familial affection. "I am the former owner of this property. I sold it to Harrison 3 days ago in a fully authorized cash transaction. These people are trespassing." The lead officer looked from me to Harrison and then down at the pristine legal deed in his hands. The pieces of the puzzle instantly snapped together in his mind. The tense defensive posture of the 4 police officers immediately dissolved into deep, unmistakable irritation. They had responded to a high-priority emergency dispatch for a violent home invasion and a potential hostage situation. Instead, they had arrived at a luxury estate to find a bitter family dispute over a legally finalized real estate transaction. The lead officer handed the deed back to Harrison with a respectful nod and turned his entire imposing frame toward my parents. He did not look amused. He looked like a man who was dangerously close to making multiple arrests. The officer hooked his thumbs into his heavy-duty belt and took a slow, deliberate step toward Patricia. He informed her in a low, carrying voice that filing a false police report to trigger a tactical emergency response was a severe criminal offense. He stated that there was no home invasion. There were no dangerous squatters. There was only a group of unauthorized individuals harassing the legal residents of a privately owned property. The officer pointed a stern finger directly at the dented ride-share vehicle idling in the driveway. He issued his final absolute command. He ordered Patricia, Richard, and Cameron to get off the property immediately, or they would all leave the upscale community in the back of a police cruiser. Richard tried to puff out his chest one last time, but the sheer physical exhaustion and the threat of imminent arrest finally broke his manufactured bravado. His shoulders slumped, and he reached out to grab Patricia by the arm. He muttered that they needed to leave and call a lawyer from a safe location. Patricia stubbornly dug her cheap sandals into the immaculate brick pavers, shaking her head in violent denial. She refused to accept that her grand return to her stolen luxury estate was ending with a police escort off the premises. But it was not Patricia or Richard who escalated the situation into a complete point of no return. It was Cameron. Cameron had been standing near the edge of the lawn, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of his earlier phone call with the federal bank investigator. His mind was a frantic, swirling vortex of locked bank accounts, wire fraud charges, and the terrifying prospect of a federal indictment. When he saw the police officers shifting their hands toward their handcuffs to enforce the trespassing order, his fragile golden child facade entirely, violently shattered. His panic-overridden brain made a disastrous miscalculation. He genuinely believed the officers were not just there to escort them off the driveway, but were actively preparing to arrest him for the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent home equity loan. The sheer pressure of the collapsing lies finally broke him. Cameron scrambled backward, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He threw his hands up in the air in a gesture of absolute surrender and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He did not try to defend his family. He did not try to maintain the wealthy tech visionary persona he had cultivated for a decade. He turned into a terrified, cornered animal and immediately threw his own mother directly to the wolves to save his own skin. "I did not forge the deed," Cameron screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Patricia's face. "She made me do it. She told me to sign the papers. My mom told me Lydia owed us the house. It was entirely her idea. I did not want to do it, but she promised me it was legal. She said she had verbal authorization. She made me create the corporate documents. I am just a victim in this." The absolute silence that fell over the driveway was staggering. Even the police officers froze momentarily, stunned by the sudden, unsolicited confession to major financial crimes. Patricia stood completely paralyzed. The deep red sunburn on her face seemed to drain away, leaving her a sickly pale color. She stared at her favorite child, her absolute golden boy, the son she had protected, bailed out, and worshipped her entire life. She had sacrificed my financial stability, my credit, and my future just to ensure Cameron never had to face a single consequence for his reckless actions. Now, the very second he faced actual severe legal jeopardy, he did not hesitate to publicly declare her the mastermind of a federal fraud ring. The betrayal was so absolute, so deeply profound, that Patricia physically swayed on her feet. Richard let out a roar of panicked fury. He lunged forward and grabbed Cameron by the collar of his wrinkled tourist shirt, aggressively shaking him. He ordered his son to shut his stupid mouth immediately. Richard frantically looked at the police officers, sweating profusely and stammering that his son was just dehydrated from the long flight and suffering from severe heat exhaustion. He insisted that Cameron was speaking pure, absolute nonsense and needed medical attention, not a criminal interrogation. The police officers, however, were no longer treating this as a simple trespassing dispute. The lead officer pulled out a small black notepad and unclipped his radio. He ordered Richard to step back and release his son immediately. The officers recognized that a spontaneous confession to forging real estate deeds and committing wire fraud was entirely out of their standard patrol jurisdiction, but it was absolutely actionable intelligence. They separated Cameron from his furious father and began asking sharp, precise questions about the exact nature of the documents he had just admitted to forging. This was the exact moment Donovan decided to strike. My attorney had been standing silently by my side, observing the entire spectacular collapse with the cold, detached calculation of an apex predator. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and stepped smoothly forward directly into the center of the chaotic driveway. "Officers, if I may clarify the situation," Donovan said, his voice projecting flawless legal authority. He opened his slim leather portfolio and extracted a thick manila folder. "I am corporate counsel for the former owner of this property. The young man currently panicking on your lawn is Cameron Wilson. He is entirely correct about the forged documents, but he is significantly downplaying his own active criminal involvement." Donovan handed the manila folder directly to the lead officer. The officer opened it and his eyes widened as he scanned the top document. Inside that folder is a sworn, legally binding affidavit from Marcus Thorne, the owner of Apex Luxury Pools and spas, Donovan stated clearly, ensuring his voice carried across the driveway to where the neighborhood residents were standing on their lawns watching the spectacle. That document explicitly details how Cameron Wilson fraudulently misrepresented himself as the legal managing agent of this property. He illegally authorized an $85,000 luxury construction contract using a forged quitclaim deed. He then attempted to leverage that forged deed to extract a $500,000 home equity line of credit from a federal banking institution. My client discovered the fraud halted the illegal construction and personally paid the contractor to clear the title so this estate could be legally sold to its current rightful owner. Cameron let out a pathetic whimpering sound. Courtney, who was still leaning against the dented rideshare vehicle, let out a sharp gasp of pure disgust. She grabbed her 2 plastic garbage bags of belongings, turned her back on her husband, and began rapidly walking down the sidewalk, entirely abandoning him to his fate. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one, and she was not going to let Cameron drag her down into a federal fraud indictment. The lead officer finished reading the sworn contractor affidavit. He closed the folder and looked directly at Cameron. He informed the terrified 30-year-old man that while the local police department would not be executing an immediate arrest for the federal banking violations, they would be officially documenting this entire interaction. The officer explicitly warned Cameron that all of this evidence, including his spontaneous public confession regarding his mother's involvement, would be immediately forwarded to the district attorney and the federal fraud division. He told Cameron to expect a very serious knock on his door from federal investigators in the immediate future. Then the officer pointed toward the street and gave his final, unyielding order. He told them to get in their vehicle and leave the premises, or they would be arrested for trespassing right now. Richard grabbed Cameron by the arm, roughly hauling him toward the idling sedan. Cameron was sobbing openly, his chest heaving as the reality of his destroyed life fully settled over him. Richard shoved his son into the back seat and turned back to collect his wife. Patricia had not moved a single muscle. She was standing in the center of the pristine driveway, entirely surrounded by the wreckage of her fabricated reality. She slowly turned her head and looked at the beautiful coastal estate she had stolen. She looked at Harrison, who was watching her with total disgust. She looked at the wealthy neighbors standing on their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering and pointing at her spectacular humiliation. She looked at the police officers who had just documented her son confessing to a federal crime that she allegedly orchestrated. Finally, she looked directly at me. I stood there in my flawless designer suit, flanked by my high-powered attorney, completely untouched by the absolute ruin consuming her life. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I simply watched her the way one watches a toxic storm finally blow itself out. Patricia realized she had absolutely no leverage left. She had no money. She had no house. She had no power over me. Her husband was a broken shell, and her golden child had betrayed her to save himself. She had lost every single game she had ever played. So she resorted to the absolute only tactic she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She decided to play the ultimate victim. Patricia's knees buckled. She dramatically collapsed onto the hard brick pavers of the driveway, landing with a heavy thud. She threw her head back and let out a piercing theatrical wail of pure agony. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing massive crocodile tears to stream down her sunburned cheeks. She reached her hands out toward me, her fingers grasping at the empty, humid air. She began to sob loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the neighborhood, desperately trying to manipulate the wealthy onlookers into believing she was just a poor, helpless mother being violently abused by her cruel, ungrateful daughter. Patricia was on her knees, clutching her chest as she sobbed loudly enough for the entire coastal cul-de-sac to hear. She was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. Thick crocodile tears streamed down her sunburned, peeling face, carving erratic tracks through her smeared, expensive makeup. She wailed that I was a monster, a cruel, heartless daughter who was throwing her own flesh and blood out onto the unforgiving street. She screamed that she had given me life, that she had sacrificed her best youthful years to raise me, and that this nightmare was how I repaid her maternal devotion. "Lydia! Please!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. "We raised you. We fed you. We put clothes on your back when you were nothing. You cannot leave your family on the street like this. You owe us." Richard, sensing a necessary shift in tactics, quickly abandoned his aggressive posturing and joined the theatrical display. He lowered his head, adopting the heavy posture of a defeated, heartbroken patriarch. He pleaded with me to remember the good times, insisting that family sticks together through thick and thin, no matter the circumstances. He begged me to call off the police, promising that we could sit down inside the house as a reasonable family and work out a mutually beneficial financial arrangement. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the brick pavers and the man standing beside her. They were desperately trying to weaponize the gazes of the wealthy neighbors who were still watching the spectacle from their manicured lawns. They wanted the crowd to see an ungrateful, wealthy daughter abusing her destitute, loving parents. But the crowd was not buying the unhinged performance, and neither was I. When Patricia screamed that they had fed me and raised me, a bitter memory flashed vividly through my mind. I remembered being 19 years old, working double shifts at a greasy local diner to pay for my basic community college classes, because Richard and Patricia had secretly drained my childhood savings account to fund Cameron's first failed tech startup. I remembered coming home physically exhausted, only to find the kitchen cabinets padlocked because Patricia did not want me eating the expensive organic groceries she had specifically purchased for her golden boy. I remembered the freezing winter nights in my unheated attic bedroom, listening to them downstairs popping imported champagne to celebrate Cameron's imaginary corporate milestones. They had not raised me. I had survived them. I had clawed my way out of their toxic, suffocating household, built a booming commercial staging business from absolutely nothing, and secured my own financial independence while they actively tried to sabotage my success at every turn. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy or hesitation. I maintained my perfectly composed posture, my face a mask of absolute chilling indifference. I stepped forward, my designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The crisp sound cut through Patricia's hysterical sobbing like a knife. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from her kneeling form. I slowly opened my leather designer bag. I reached inside and retrieved 2 specific items. The first was a single dull brass key attached to a cheap, bright yellow plastic keychain. The second was a crisp, freshly printed $100 bill. I held them out for a brief moment, letting the bright Florida sunlight catch the metal and the paper, ensuring Patricia saw exactly what I was holding in my hand. Then I simply opened my fingers and let them drop. The brass key hit the brick driveway with a sharp metallic clink. The $100 bill fluttered down, landing right next to Patricia's trembling knees. "Here is the key to your storage unit," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing clearly across the quiet driveway. "It is Unit 402 at the industrial park on the edge of town. I paid the $90 monthly fee through the end of the current month. All of your junk mail, your past due credit card statements, and the few cheap belongings you left behind are sitting inside that concrete box." Patricia stopped sobbing mid-breath. She stared at the cheap brass key and the single $100 bill on the ground as if they were venomous snakes. "And here is $100, I continued, gesturing to the cash on the bricks. "That will cover the cost of an extra-large Uber to transport you, your husband, your criminal son, and your luggage to the storage facility. After today, you are entirely on your own. Do not ever contact me again." Before Patricia could even process the sheer brutality of my statement, a new vehicle pulled rapidly into the driveway. It was an unmarked dark gray sedan. A man in a plain suit stepped out, flashing a gold badge clipped to his belt. The patrol officers had radioed for a financial crimes detective the exact moment Cameron had spontaneously confessed to wire fraud and real estate forgery. The detective walked over to the lead officer, exchanging a few quiet, urgent words before turning his attention to the chaotic scene unfolding on the lawn. I turned away from my parents and walked directly toward the newly arrived detective. Donovan matched my stride, remaining a silent, intimidating presence at my shoulder. The detective introduced himself as Detective Miller, casting a wary professional glance at Patricia, who was still kneeling on the ground in stunned, absolute silence. Detective Miller, I said, smoothly extending my hand. My name is Lydia Wilson. I believe I have some critical information that will greatly expedite your current investigation into Cameron Wilson's real estate fraud. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, heavily bound manila folder. It was over 2 inches thick, packed with meticulously organized documents, highlighted bank statements, and notarized financial logs. I had spent years quietly and methodically compiling this specific file, waiting patiently for the exact right moment to deploy it. By the way, I said, handing the heavy folder directly to the detective. I would also like to officially file a comprehensive police report for long-term identity theft and grand financial fraud against my parents, Richard and Patricia Wilson. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He took a stumbling step backward, his face turning an ashen, sickly white. The 12 years of certified bank records showing my parents stealing my identity to fund his failed businesses are all in there, I explained, tapping the heavy cover of the folder. When I was 22 years old, I discovered that Richard and Patricia had illegally opened 6 different high-limit credit cards using my social security number. They forged my signature on the applications. They maxed out every single card to purchase luxury vehicles and fund Cameron's disastrous early cryptocurrency ventures. When the businesses inevitably collapsed, they defaulted on the massive debt and completely destroyed my credit score. I spent my entire 20s living in cheap, dangerous apartments, unable to secure a basic car loan, while I fought tooth and nail to repair the absolute financial ruin they caused. I paused, ensuring my voice carried perfectly to where my parents were standing paralyzed in the sun. They thought they got away with it because the statute of limitations on the original credit card fraud had expired. However, what they do not know is that I recently uncovered their secondary active fraud network. Inside that folder, you will find absolute proof that they are currently using my stolen social security number to maintain hidden offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide their remaining assets from the IRS. You will also find documentation proving they routinely committed tax fraud by attempting to claim my staging business revenue as their own corporate income. Detective Miller opened the thick folder. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes widening dramatically as he took in the sheer volume and immaculate organization of the hard evidence. He saw the certified bank transfers, the highlighted IP addresses, tracing the fraudulent applications directly back to Richard's home computer, and the official IRS tax transcripts proving the income manipulation. This was not a messy, complicated family dispute that would require months of tedious, difficult investigation. This was a perfectly packaged, undeniable criminal case wrapped up with a neat little bow. The detective snapped the folder shut. He looked at me with a profound mixture of professional respect and absolute astonishment. He nodded once, acknowledging the devastating power of the weapon I had just handed him. Detective Miller turned around and signaled to the 2 uniformed patrol officers. The officers immediately adjusted their tactical stances and began moving purposefully toward my parents. Richard and Patricia Wilson, the detective called out, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air with absolute authority. I need you both to step away from the property and walk toward the cruiser. We are going to the precinct for extensive questioning regarding identity theft, wire fraud, and federal tax evasion. Cameron Wilson, you are coming with us as well. Richard's knees completely buckled. He grabbed the side of the police cruiser to keep himself from collapsing onto the burning pavement. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, defeated old man who had finally run out of lies to tell. Patricia remained frozen on her knees, staring blankly at the yellow plastic keychain resting on the brick driveway. She did not scream. She did not cry. Her mind had completely short-circuited, unable to process the absolute total destruction of her fabricated life. Cameron began hyperventilating again, blabbering incoherently about how he was just a victim, but the officers ignored his pathetic whining. They efficiently patted him down and guided him toward the back of the squad car. Courtney was already half a block away, walking briskly down the sidewalk, with her garbage bags, not looking back a single time. I did not stay to watch them place my parents in handcuffs. I had seen exactly enough. The years of emotional manipulation, the stolen money, the relentless gaslighting, and the sheer exhausting burden of carrying their toxic weight were finally over. I had outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and completely dismantled their fraudulent empire using nothing but truth and meticulous preparation. I turned my back on the flashing police lights and the murmuring crowd of wealthy neighbors. I walked gracefully toward the idling black town car. Donovan opened the heavy rear door for me, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. The pristine air conditioning washed over me, cool and refreshing against the oppressive Florida heat. Donovan closed the door with a solid, satisfying click, entirely shutting out the noise of my family's final ruin. "To the office, ma'am," the driver asked respectfully, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "No," I replied, leaning back into the plush leather and letting out a long, deep, peaceful breath. "Take me to the airport. I have a first-class flight to Paris to catch." The driver nodded and pulled the sleek vehicle away from the curb. As the car glided smoothly down the manicured street, I did not look back. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the road ahead, completely ready to begin the rest of my life. 1 month later, the warm coastal breeze felt entirely different. I stood on a pristine stretch of undeveloped beachfront property, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves. The air smelled of salt and absolute unfiltered freedom. Paris had been exactly the palate cleanser I needed, a luxurious 2-week escape filled with Michelin-starred dinners and quiet mornings drinking espresso on cobblestone balconies. I had turned my phone off for the entire trip, ignoring the frantic voicemails from unknown numbers and allowing the sheer magnitude of the explosive driveway showdown to settle. When I finally powered my device back on during the flight home, my inbox was flooded with the spectacular aftermath of my family's total destruction. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. Cameron was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and interstate forgery. The bank had seized every single asset he falsely claimed to own, leaving him absolutely destitute. Courtney did not wait a single second to protect her own interests. She filed for divorce the exact day Cameron posted his heavily restricted bail, ensuring the legal paperwork was served to him at his cheap motel. She had immediately launched a public smear campaign against him on social media, violently distancing herself from his criminal empire and painting herself as the ultimate victim of his narcissistic lies. Richard and Patricia suffered a fate they considered far worse than actual prison. They were currently out on bail, awaiting their own federal trial for identity theft and massive tax evasion. The IRS had descended upon them like a swarm of locusts, freezing their remaining hidden accounts and launching a brutal forensic audit into 12 years of fabricated financial returns. Without access to their stolen funds, they were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the grimy industrial edge of the city. It featured peeling linoleum floors, paper-thin walls, and the constant deafening roar of the nearby interstate. It was located less than 3 miles from the cheap storage facility, holding the pathetic remnants of their fake luxury life. Their former wealthy friends instantly blacklisted them. Their prestigious country club formally revoked their membership and mailed them a public ban notice. They were entirely shunned by the social circle they had sacrificed my future to impress. I did not feel a single drop of pity for any of them. I unrolled the thick architectural blueprints I was holding in my hands, letting the bright morning sunlight illuminate the intricate white lines. For years, I had used my boutique staging business to transform other people's empty houses into stunning, profitable homes. I had hauled heavy couches, dealt with demanding real estate agents, and quietly built my massive corporate network while my family actively tried to bleed me dry. Now I was finally building something permanently and exclusively for myself. A sleek black town car pulled smoothly onto the gravel shoulder of the coastal highway behind me. Donovan stepped out of the vehicle, looking as impeccably sharp as always. The crisp ocean breeze ruffled his dark suit jacket as he walked purposefully across the sandy grass toward my pristine plot of land. He was carrying his signature leather portfolio, but his usual severe professional scowl was replaced by a broad, genuine smile. He stopped beside me and looked out at the rolling blue ocean and the expansive clear horizon. He took a deep breath of the salt air and nodded his absolute approval. The federal prosecutors called my office this morning. Donovan said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. They confirmed that Richard and Patricia have completely surrendered. They are attempting to negotiate a plea deal to avoid maximum sentencing, but the fraud division is pushing for mandatory jail time and total financial restitution. Cameron is facing a minimum of 5 years in a federal facility. Your stolen identity has been completely scrubbed from their accounts, and your credit profile is entirely restored. You are permanently legally severed from their entire disaster. I kept my eyes fixed on the beautiful ocean horizon. That is exactly what I wanted to hear. I replied, my voice perfectly steady and light. Let them negotiate with the federal government. They are no longer my problem. Donovan opened his leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of premium legal documents. He clicked a heavy silver fountain pen and held it out to me. The commercial zoning permits have cleared the city council, Donovan stated, tapping the bottom line of the top page. The environmental impact studies are perfect, and the title is absolutely pristine. Harrison's real estate group was so impressed by how ruthlessly you handled that mechanic's lien that they actually referred this commercial broker directly to my office. The $1.3 million from the cash sale of your parents' former estate is sitting safely in the escrow account, ready to be deployed. I took the heavy silver pen from his hand. I looked down at the blueprints showcasing the modern sweeping architecture of the luxury boutique hotel I had spent the last 3 years secretly designing in my head. It featured an open-air lobby, imported glass infinity pools, and cascading private terraces that I would personally curate. I had the capital, I had the industry connections, and I finally had the absolute freedom to execute my ultimate vision. I signed my name on the final commercial lease agreement with bold, decisive strokes. I flipped to the next page and signed the construction authorization, transferring the $1.3 million directly into the development fund. Every single cent of the money my parents had tried to steal from me was now actively breaking ground on my new empire. I handed the pen and the finalized documents back to Donovan. He securely locked them inside his portfolio and offered me a firm, respectful handshake. I turned back to face the vast, beautiful ocean, listening to the powerful crash of the waves against the pristine shore. My family had spent my entire life trying to bury me under the weight of their relentless toxic entitlement. They had demanded my money, my credit, and my absolute submission. But they had severely underestimated my resilience. They thought they were building a luxury life on my back, but they had simply provided the ashes I needed to build my own kingdom. I stood on my own land, entirely independent and perfectly complete. Looking back at the smoldering ashes of my family's fabricated empire, the most profound lesson I learned was about the true nature of loyalty and self-worth. We are heavily conditioned to believe that blood ties form an unbreakable contract, a lifelong debt we owe simply by existing. However, love and respect should never be transactional, and the word family should never serve as a convenient synonym for financial exploitation. My parents and brother equated my value entirely with what they could extract from my bank accounts and my identity. They mistook my calculated silence for weakness and my long-term patience for submission. What they completely failed to understand is that true power does not roar or throw tantrums on a manicured lawn. It meticulously plans. It gathers indisputable evidence. It quietly builds an impenetrable foundation while the toxic people around you look the other way. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your success is routinely minimized, your boundaries are aggressively violated, and your resources are drained by the very people supposed to protect you, hear this clearly. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. Walking away is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of necessary self-preservation.
Oli, ¿qué tal?
The
¿Cómo
immense energy you
estamos?
waste
Ay,
trying to
adiós,
earn
Mary, que
impossible
tengas un muy
approval
buen día
is the
y todo
exact
súper
energy you
bien.
need to
¿Cómo
build your
estamos,
own
chicos?
empire.
Ay, yo no
True
sé cuándo
wealth
voy a
is not
terminar.
a stolen
Aún
address
me
or
queda,
a
tío. Estoy
forged
terminando
corporate
el tema
deed.
6.
It
son
is the
12, me
absolute
quedan 6.
unshakable
Le
peace
quitamos
of
uno que es
knowing you
hembra, que
can
es
stand
petit,
entirely on your own two
pues me quedan
feet.
5.
Share your
Bueno, no está
stories of
mal,
drawing
no
hard
está
lines
mal.
and protecting your peace in the
Qué
comments
hambre, tuve un
below.
hambre brutal, ¿eh?
If
¿Qué
my
hora es,
journey to
tío?
absolute
Las
independence
12 y 8,
resonated
tío.
with you, hit the like
Justo
button
acabé
and
ahora, me
subscribe
alegro
for more
muchísimo,
stories of
Débora.
reclaiming your power.
Ay,
Remember, you
chicas,
always
escucho tu
have the
historias
absolute right
montando.
to walk away
Tranquila,
and build your own
tranquila.
kingdom.
Normal.